This was a path filled with thistles and thorns. In the beginning, perhaps there were paths that could be followed by others. However, the further they went, the narrower the road became. Since there was no path to follow, he could only forge his own path. It was very easy to get lost in the boundless wilderness. The 100 hosts had used 100 lifetimes to forge a path that led to the great path of the god of cooking. The artifact spirits had been looking forward to it for 100 lifetimes, but they had also been disappointed. And in this life, it might be their most promising time. Buzz Xiaopi emerged from the void. He turned into a beam of golden light, landed on Bufang's shoulder, and blew bubbles quietly. Even though he was already Heaven God space, he still liked to blow bubbles. The artifact spirits were in high spirits. They had thought that Bufang had been defeated. Unexpectedly, Bufang had given them hope again. Sloth Great Soul, Overlord's pupils constricted. He didn't seem to expect such a turn of events. The turn of events caught him off guard. Die! Sloth Great Soul, Overlord, made up his mind in a flash. With just a thought, heaven and earth changed colors. Even the terrifying stars seemed to be destroyed. Then, he threw out a palm. With a terrible rumble, it slapped toward Bufang from afar. Bufang ignored it. He didn't even look up and just kept cooking. The dish was about to take shape. An aroma lingered. With Xiaopi's help, the dish was finally coming to an end. Sloth Great Soul, Overlord's palm was shockingly powerful. The monstrous power of sin spread. He wanted to kill Bufang once and for all. Suddenly, Bufang turned off the stove. Everything became very quiet. Heat was surging in the ladle, and the golden broth was glowing. Bufang poured the sauce from the ladle onto the dish. Buzz, a divine light, seemed to soar into the sky and tear it apart. Then, it turned into a beam of light and collided with Sloth Great Soul, Overlord's palm. Sloth's body went limp. That overbearing palm strike lost its ferociousness like melted chocolate in the midst of this fragrance. Sloth Great Soul, Overlord's expression changed. This dish, is it cooked by this chef after all? Sloth glanced over his shoulder at the rift formed by the hourglass of time and space. There, half of the soul god's body was about to rush out, but the powerful force of the cosmic barrier prevented him from doing so. Bufang was not wearing the vermilion robe. He was only wearing a plain white robe. She looked like an otherworldly lotus flower, incomparably fair and holy. In front of Bufang, a blue and white porcelain plate floated. On it was a dish that glowed with golden light. His mental force went into the dish. He could feel the surging aura in it. There were mountains, oceans, lands, and fields. It was like a miniature of heaven and earth. However, he could sense that the ingredients were connected by a golden light. Therefore, the dish was not perfect. Bufang took a deep breath. He pointed a finger at the dish. It slowly floated out of the plate. Buzz, congratulations to the host for completing the pseudo-god of cooking dish, the mountain and river painting. The system's serious voice rang out in Bufang's head. Bufang's face was as calm as an ancient well. A pseudo-god of cooking dish. Is it because of Xiaopi? If it weren't for Xiaopi, this dish might not have been formed at all. Bufang's face was expressionless as he breathed a faint sigh of relief. Then, the system's voice fell silent. Meanwhile, Bufang's aura changed slightly. Sloth Great Soul, Overlord, whose move was broken, was not reconciled. He could not let Bufang continue to grow. So, he finally moved. He left the 7 hourglasses. His huge body rumbled, crossed the universe, and appeared in front of Bufang. Sloth's body shrank and turned into a little fatty. His eyes were fixed on Bufang. With a shake of his hand, a pitch-black halberd appeared in his grip. It was the soul god's weapon, and its power was boundless. Without hesitation, he swung it toward Bufang. He wanted to kill Bufang in the starry sky and completely cut off the chef's path of growth. The hourglasses were spinning. Tongtian's eyes lit up. This is my chance. However, the 6 great soul overlords in the distance were also trying to stop him. Even with the help of Bufang's 5 artifact spirits, he still felt it was difficult to stop them. Fight! But this is my only chance. Tongtian's eyes fell on Soul God's body. I can't let this existence, who is as terrifying as my master, appear. Fight! Tong Tian roared. He jerked his hands toward the sky. Countless stars exploded and shattered. The immortal slaughtering sword array appeared again and crushed down. Sloth Great Soul Overlord charged at him. Bufong's face was expressionless as he looked quietly at the dish. His face was full of pity and regret. A pseudo-god of cooking dish. That meant the dish was still a failure. It was a fake. The Tao had done everything. However, Bufong was not too disappointed. At least, he had found a way out of the endless confusion and darkness. He could continue to move forward with determination. Boom! A black halberd came exploding toward him. The void shattered. A terrible murderous aura filled the sky. The eyes of Sloth Great Soul Overlord, who had transformed into a little fatty, were filled with killing intent. It was aimed at Bufong. Dish, smash, chef, kill. Sloth Great Soul Overlord, who was a perfected chaotic saint, finally attacked. He was getting closer and closer. The moment the halberd was about to hit Bufong's head, Xiao Bai, who had been standing behind Bufong, moved. He opened his huge palm and grabbed the halberd with clang. Then, a beam of purple light shot out of his purple eyes and smashed Sloth's body. Oh! Sloth tilted his head and dodged. The hand holding the halberd gave him a sudden twist. Then, the halberd began to spin rapidly. The next moment, it exploded out with thousands of attacks. The halberd broke free from Xiao Bai's grip. Bufong sighed faintly. He raised his hand. He pinched the dish in front of him with 2 fingers, and the steaming hot dish in front of him was caught between his fingers. It seemed to have turned into a dragon that towered into the sky. He flicked his finger. It hit the halberd. Dong! A sound that sounded like the ringing of the great path bells rang out. Sloth's pupils constricted. He was horrified to find that the halberd, the soul god's weapon, had softened under the impact of the fragrance. What's going on? The dragon of fragrance continued to circle, approaching Sloth Great Soul Overlord. Sloth was so frightened that he let go of the halberd. Wrapped in a fragrance, the halberd shattered in midair. What kind of technique is this? In the distance, Bufong slowly raised his head. He looked at Sloth with an expressionless face. His cultivation base, which was as strong as a saint of the Great Path, began to grow slowly. Yes, it was growing slowly. However, although it was slow, it was steady. Chaotic energy began to grow and swirl around Bufong's body. 1, 2, 3. Countless wisps of chaotic energy seemed to turn into a vast expanse of primordial chaos. Soon, Bufong's aura reached the level of a chaotic saint. A pseudo-god of cooking dish, the stately painting, had finally made Bufong step into the level of a chaotic saint. Perhaps he was not the only one among the 100 hosts who had stepped into this level. However, he was definitely the most special one. This could be seen from the excited eyes of the 5 artifact spirits. Tong Tian was also very excited. He burst out laughing. To him, Bufong breaking through the shackles was the best news he could ask for. Our counterattack has begun. Tong Tian roared with laughter. He flicked his sleeve. The immortal slaughtering sword array flew out and pressed down on the Great Soul Overlord. Envy Great Soul Overlord's body was cut in half and turned into a cloud of sinful energy. The other Great Soul Overlords were also shocked. Sloth's pupils constricted. His face grew serious as he looked at Bufong, whose aura had stepped into the level of a chaotic saint. Bufong, who had just stepped into the level of a chaotic saint, actually gave him a sense of oppression. Could it be that he could already fight a perfected being as soon as he stepped into the chaotic saint realm? Were all chefs so freakish? And that dish, it was like the top magic treasure of the primitive universe. Damn it! Xiao Bai's purple eyes narrowed. The next moment, his stomach began to spin. In the starry sky, the true forms of the soul demons floating in the starry sky howled and flew toward Xiao Bai's black hole. They were swallowed by Xiao Bai. Rumble, Xiao Bai's body was rumbling. Sloth Great Soul Overlord was shocked. A roar that shook the universe rang out. The soul god's terrible aura was about to descend. Sloth was overjoyed. However, his expression soon changed. Because in front of the 7 hourglasses of time and space, Tongtian suddenly took out a dark yellow flag. He waved it. 3 terrifying auras descended. A Taoist sat in the starry sky with bright eyes and a huge axe in his hand. A Buddha with a peaceful face had a large bell over his head, which had endless energy flowing over it. A graceful figure swayed in the starry sky. Her lower body was that of a serpent god, but her upper body was emitting a supreme aura of the great Tao. She was holding a 7-color divine stone in her hand. The appearance of these 3 experts, Sloth's expression flickered with horror. The experts of the primitive universe were going to suppress the soul god. Chapter 1804. Damn it. Sloth Great Soul Overlord never thought that the experts of the primitive universe would strike at this moment. Had Tongtian been waiting for this opportunity? Was he waiting for him to leave the 7 hourglasses? Their goal was to stop the soul god from coming. The fact that Tongtian had come with Bufang, who was not afraid of death, was just a facade. In fact, he had already prepared many experts to give soul god a thunderous blow. This blow would completely crush the soul god's hope. Sloth Great Soul Overlord was furious. He wanted to leave his body and return to the 7 hourglasses. However, this time, he was stopped by someone. With a dish in his hand, Bufang hovered in front of him. He slowly turned his head and glanced indifferently at Sloth. That glance made Sloth's heart skip a beat. "You, stay here and play with me," Bufang said lightly. "Oh." Sloth Great Soul Overlord flew into a rage. He was going to stop the experts of the primitive universe. How could he be stopped by Bufang? In fact, the primitive universe was stronger than the soul demon universe in terms of high-end fighting force. However, the great path of the primitive universe would restrain those experts. Besides, if they were given enough time, they would definitely grow to be very powerful in the primitive universe. There were no restrictions on them. That was the main reason why they coveted the primitive universe. The experts of the primitive universe made the great path flawless and allowed the soul demons to grow unscrupulously. It was the best paradise for the soul demons. As long as the soul god descended, gathered his fleshly body, and returned to the primitive universe, the soul god would lead them to conquer the primitive universe. Sloth's eyes turned red in an instant. He did not want to pay attention to Bufang. At this moment, the importance of killing Bufang was not as important as stopping the primitive universe experts. Roar! Sloth's sinful power spread out and wrapped his palm in an attempt to knock Bufang away. Even though Bufang's cultivation base had broken through to the chaotic saint realm, he was still weaker than a perfected expert. Compared to a perfected expert, he was still a little weaker. Therefore, he was fearless. Bufang held the pseudo-god of cooking dish, the stately painting. He gave Sloth an indifferent look. He waved his hand in front of the dish. It was as if he was pinching the fragrance, causing it to continuously twirl around his palm like a tornado. "I said play with me." Bufang pursed his lips. "Why I want you to be with me, you don't. Why I don't need you to accompany me. I'll desperately come over. Who do you think I, Bufang, am?" Then his palm collided with Sloth's. The fragrance and the power of sin intertwined and exploded. Sloth Great Soul Overlord stood motionless. Bufang's body was also as solid as a rock. The two attacks were actually equally matched. Xiao Bai was still sucking the true forms of countless fallen soul demons into Xiao Bai's belly. His purple eyes became deeper and more frightening in the distance. The sect master of heaven had the immortal slaying sword array above his head. He held the Qingping sword in his hand and brandished thousands of sword chi. A great bell rumbled and rang with a deafening sound. Primal chaos, chi, kept pouring down from the bell. The Buddha supporting the bell had a peaceful look on his face as he chanted, causing heaven and earth to tremble. When he threw out his palm, it was as if 10,000 Buddhas were paying homage to him, attracting the light of heaven and earth. Accompanied by the ringing of the bell, it suppressed the soul god, who had half of his body rushed out of the cosmic barrier. Goddess Nuwa held the 7-colored divine stone in her hand and pushed it forward. The stone flew out and pressed down as if it was a part of heaven and earth. Yuanshi, Tianzuan rolled up the sleeves of his Taoist robe and grabbed the huge axe with both hands. With just a thought, he seemed to have the will to split heaven and earth. His eyes burst into dazzling light. He scolded. The axe slashed toward the soul god's body, accompanied by thousands of blasts. The soul god was like a trapped beast, bound by heaven and earth, unable to break free. He bellowed. His featureless face was now clearly visible. One of his arms was wrapped with the power of the great sins. It was as if the will of the soul demon universe had descended upon this part of the world. He wanted to break through the will of the primitive universe. In Hangu Pass, many immortals, deities, and Buddhas sat cross-legged on the ancient and mottled walls of the city. They looked at the many magnificent figures fighting in the distant void. They were all very peaceful. The sound of the Tao, the sound of the Zen, all kinds of miraculous sounds erupted. Rumble, thousands of clouds rolled over the great city of Hangu Pass. Purple thunderbolts could be seen jumping in the clouds in the starry sky. The purple thunderbolts rumbled and filled the air in an instant, carrying the aura of the great path. Then, they sped toward the battlefield in the distance. The soul god was being suppressed. He kept retreating as if he was really going to return to the soul demon universe. Sloth Great Soul Overlord was very anxious, but he never thought that Bu Fong could stop him with a dish. The aroma of the dish had a very strong suppression on him. Scram! Sloth Great Soul Overlord roared. He sped up immediately. His speed was really too fast. It was completely different from his name of laziness. Even Bu Fong, who had mastered the law of space, was slightly taken aback. However, Xiaopi's body grew larger and turned into a giant mantis shrimp, carrying Bu Fong on his back. Then, he turned into a beam of golden light and approached Sloth Great Soul Overlord. Bam! 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 Two beams of light, one black and the other gold, kept colliding in midair. Each collision caused heaven and earth to shake. However, an even fiercer battle was still taking place in the distance. The experts of the primitive universe had forcibly suppressed the soul god. Rumble, the great path swept over. Thunderclouds rolled across the sky. Tongtian's expression changed dramatically. This was the will of the great path. How could it come so fast? The will of the great path was not targeting the soul god, but the experts who had used power beyond the limits of the universe. Hurry up, Tongtian bellowed. They had to speed up, or the will of the great path would descend. They might be injured. If that happened, they would not have a chance to suppress this great demon anymore. Bu Fong's expression froze. He held the dish in his hand. Sloth Great Soul Overlord steadied himself. He let out a long roar. The eyes of the 6 great soul overlords, who were fighting the 5 artifact spirits, narrowed. They had forced back the 5 artifact spirits and sped toward the experts of the primitive universe. Get lost, Tongtian roared. The immortal slaughtering sword array pressed down. As long as he could hold these great soul overlords back so that Yuanshi, Tianzuan, and the others could suppress them, they would be able to survive the calamity. Suddenly, Tongtian's expression changed. Envy Great Soul Overlord came roaring, his eyes full of madness. The sinful power swirling around him was extremely unstable and pulsing violently. It collided with the immortal slaughtering sword array. It exploded with a boom. Bam! It was like the most terrible explosion in the universe. The explosion sent Tongtian flying backward a few steps. His face was unsightly. The immortal slaughtering sword array was scattered and hovered behind him. It was self-detonation. The self-detonation of a great soul overlord was not the kind of physical explosion, but the kind where even the soul demon's true form would explode. Once he self-detonated, he would be turned into ashes and his Tao would disappear. Why was he so decisive? Tongtian's heart suddenly trembled. Envy Great Soul Overlord's self-detonation had opened an opening. The other great soul overlords flew past. Tongtian's heart skipped a beat. Greed Great Soul Overlord roared. his eyes full of madness. "Your Excellency, Soul God, come quickly!" He roared and rushed toward the Buddha, who had the chaos bell over his head. The Buddha's palm was suppressing the Soul God. Greed, great soul, overlord approached. With a rumble, his body began to expand strangely, then burst into pieces. Bam! It was an explosion that sounded like the end of the world. The chaos bell shook violently under the impact, and the Buddha's face flickered. "Gluttony, great soul, overlord," roared, his body swollen. He rushed toward Yuanshi Tianzuan. Without hesitation, his body collided with Yuanshi Tianzuan's heaven-splitting axe. Puff! Yuanshi Tianzuan focused his eyes. The heaven-splitting axe was knocked away. One great soul overlord was not enough, and another great soul overlord was coming. The self-detonation of a soul demon and his true form. The power of the self-detonation of a top chaotic saint was extraordinary. It had actually blocked the powerful attack of a great perfection stage powerhouse. Pride great soul overlord rushed toward Nuwa. He self-detonated. The seven-color divine stone was knocked away and fell back into Nuwa's hand. Nuwa's expression flickered. The means that the experts of the primitive universe had prepared for so long were stopped at this moment. It had actually been forcibly stopped. The remaining two great soul overlords also self-detonated. The fluctuation caused by their self-detonation, it seemed to blow the universe into nothingness. The hourglass of time and space kept shaking, and trembling Soul God took the opportunity to rip it open. He went one step further. He had taken one leg out, and the other leg was still stuck in the soul demon universe. He was only one step away from entering the primitive universe. The expressions of Yuanshi, Tianzuan, Nuwa, and the Buddha all changed dramatically. The next moment, they wanted to suppress them again. However, they were too slow. The will of the great path of the purple thunderclouds rolled over. Accompanied by a rumbling sound, it suppressed the three existences. The three almighty experts were forced back. They did not dare to continue to use the top divine artifacts of the primitive universe. If they continued to use them, the primitive universe would completely collapse. This was not what they wanted to see. Yuanshi Tianzuan sighed. There was a hint of helplessness and reluctance in his eyes. After all, they were still a little short. They wanted to suppress the soul god before the will of the great path descended. But they were still a little short. No one thought that the great soul overlords of the soul demon universe would be so decisive. Sloth Great Soul Overlord laughed excitedly. His smile was somewhat crazy. "It's too late. You can't stop them. You can't stop them." Sloth burst out laughing. In Hangapass, purple clouds filled the air. Countless experts were silent as they watched the outcome in the sky. Taishang Laojun held a horsetail whisk, his face extremely unsightly. He closed his eyes and sighed. The great path is ruthless. Sure enough, he flicked his horsetail whisk. Then, he threw his head back and sighed. Prepare for a battle of life and death. He furrowed his brows. This kind of situation was something that he had never expected. The six great soul overlords had chosen to self-detonate. They were great soul overlords, and it was extremely difficult for them to be born. However, their self-detonation was not useless. It had given Soul God an opportunity. Now Soul God was on the verge of breaking free. Once he entered the primitive universe, it would be a disaster. Soul God was a creature from another universe. By breaking through the cosmic barrier, he had jumped out of the great path and was no longer under the control of the will. Therefore, the will of the great path did not threaten him. What a pity! Sloth Great Soul Overlord was very excited. He looked respectfully and crazily at Soul God, who only had half a foot left in the Soul Demon universe. He knelt in midair and kowtowed towards Soul God. Every time he kowtowed, Soul God broke free from the universe's restraint a little. The power of the great sin spread. Tongtian's face was pale. The faces of the other experts were unsightly as well. They succeeded because of the great path, and they failed because of it. The great path of the primitive universe had given birth to many experts, which was enough to suppress the soul demon universe. However, the restraint of the will of the Great Path had made them miss the chance to suppress Soul God. Were they really going to be defeated? The sound of Sloth Great Soul, Overlord's kowtowing, kept rumbling in their hearts. It made their hearts tremble. Despair filled the air. Suddenly, Bu Fong sighed. His sigh startled many people. Bu Fong put one hand behind his back and held the pseudo-god of cooking dish in the other. He took a step. The void shook. "Come back," Bu Fong said with an expressionless face. As soon as he finished speaking, the god of cooking sets in the distance burst into golden light. The roars of dragons, tigers, birds, turtles, cheelants, they turned into 5 streams of light and shot to Bu Fong's side. He was clad in the vermilion robe. The dragon bone kitchen knife and the cheelant transmigration ladle hovered at his sides. The black turtle constellation wok hovered over his head. The white tiger heaven stove was under his feet. Bu Fong walked step by step toward Soul God, who only had 1 foot left. Sloth Great Soul, Overlord froze. Tong Tian, Yuan Shi, Tianzuan, and the others were stunned as well. They looked at Bu Fong. He hovered in front of a huge, faceless soul god. The corner of Bu Fong's mouth twitched slightly. "Have you asked me if you want to come out? What a coincidence. I'm not bound by the great path of the primitive universe either." Chapter 1805. Did you ask me? Did you? His voice was deafening. It was like the rumbling of thunder that resounded throughout the heavens, causing even the stars to tremble. His voice was indifferent and emotionless. Clad in luxurious equipment, Bu Fong walked through the starry sky and came step by step to the soul god, who was about to break free from the barrier between the soul demon universe and the primitive universe. That gave everyone pause. Sloth Great Soul, Overlord froze. His pupils constricted as if he could not believe it. Tong Tian was taken aback. The 4 swords floated around him. Yuan Shi, Tianzuan, the Buddha, Goddess Nuwa. They all looked at Bu Fong in confusion. In their eyes, Bu Fong's cultivation base was only at the level of a new chaotic saint, but the chaotic energy he possessed was astonishing. They had never encountered such a situation before. However, given the current situation, they had no choice but to pin all their hopes on Bu Fong. Could this young man, who had suddenly appeared, stop the disaster? Tong Tian burst out laughing. He never thought that Bu Fong would be so ferocious. Also, he almost forgot that Bu Fong came from the chaotic universe and was not bound by the primitive universe's will of the Great Path. Therefore, Bu Fong could do what they could not. Bu Fong's aura was ethereal. He hovered in front of the huge soul god. Compared with the faceless soul god, Bu Fong's body was much smaller. The soul god's body seemed to be able to support the whole starry sky. Bu Fong, on the other hand, hovered in front of the faceless soul god like a speck of dust. It was as if the latter could kill Bu Fong with just a breath. Sloth Great Soul, Overlord's eyes widened. "I can't believe Bu Fong has stepped forward. What makes this stinky chef think he can do it? With his insignificant cultivation base, he is not even a perfected chaotic saint. What makes him think he can stop the soul god? Even though the soul god has not completely broken free from the barrier of the universe. Even so, he is not someone a chef who has just stepped into the realm of chaotic saints can fight against." Bu Fong looked indifferently at soul god. After experiencing the previous soul baptism, the current Bu Fong seemed to have become a completely different person. There was no emotion in his eyes, and the expression on his face was incomparably calm. Rumble, the purple will of the heavenly Tao, surged over violently. Heaven and earth trembled. Purple lightning fell from the clouds and tore through the starry sky. Tong Tian's pupils constricted. He let out a long whistle. The Qingping sword emanated a purple aura as it clashed head-on with the heavenly Tao lightning. The heavenly Tao was heartless, and the heavenly Tao followed the rules. He had broken rules, so he naturally had to be punished. He blocked the thunderbolt with his sword. In the distance, the primordial Lord of Heaven, shrouding Buddha, and Nuwa were also resisting the will of the heavenly path. They couldn't do anything for the time being. Perhaps Bu Fong was the only one who could stop Soul God now. If Bufong lost too, then this battle would truly be over. From this day onwards, the primordial universe, there would never be a day of peace. Boom! The terrifying will and the purple lightning made everyone's heart sink. It was hard to say who would win this battle. Bufong had just stepped into the realm of chaotic saints. Could he stop it? Even the few perfected chaotic saints could not stop it. How could mere Bufong stop it? Roar. There seemed to be a soundless roar that shook the universe. Soul God raised his huge arm. His palm was as black as ink, and the power of the great sins swirled around it. Then he slapped it down toward Bufong. He wanted to slap Bufong to death. Bufong was as motionless as a mountain. His mind flickered. Behind him, an incomparably huge divine sense phantom suddenly appeared. Its golden light illuminated the whole universe. The current Bufong was really coquettish. In the face of the soul god's palm, Bufong raised his hand. The black turtle constellation, Wok, suddenly emerged. A turtle cry rang out. An enormous black tortoise shadow suddenly appeared above the black turtle constellation Wok. It blotted out the sun, turned into a huge turtle shell, and blocked Bufong's body. Supreme energy swirled over the turtle shell. The soul god's palm struck the turtle shell, causing it to tremble violently. Bufong flicked his fingers. A fragrant aroma burst out of the dish in his hand. It fused into the wok. The wok, which was on the verge of breaking, actually blocked the power of the palm. Sloth Great Soul Overlord was shocked when he saw that. I can't believe this chef can really block it. This is not good news. I can't let him continue to cause trouble. Sloth narrowed his eyes. He raised his hand. The power of sin immediately condensed into a black halberd, which looked exactly like the one before. He waved the halberd and unleashed a shocking power. Then he smashed it toward Bufong. Bufong glanced at Sloth Great Soul Overlord. He did not move. Suddenly, a ray of white light suddenly shot out. The next moment, a purple eye was reflected in Sloth Great Soul Overlord's pupils. That iron puppet. Yes, it was none other than Xiao Bai. Xiao Bai stopped absorbing the soul demon's true forms and stood in front of Sloth Great Soul Overlord. Get lost, Sloth bellowed. He waved the halberd and smashed it toward Xiao Bai. Bam! However, the halberd struck Xiao Bai. The blow, which was powerful enough to shatter the starry sky, did not shake Xiao Bai's fleshly body at all. Xiao Bai's mechanical eyes turned. Then he raised his huge palm and grabbed the halberd. Rumble. All of a sudden, Xiao Bai's style changed abruptly. It was extremely sharp. A crack rang out. The halberd was crushed. Xiao Bai's fist smashed Sloth Great Soul Overlord. Sloth Great Soul Overlord was knocked flying 10,000 miles away. Several stars have been smashed into smithereens. What's going on? The almighty experts of the primitive universe, who were struggling to resist the will of the great path, were startled. They turned to look at the battle in the distance and saw Xiao Bai knock Sloth Great Soul Overlord away with a punch. Sloth Great Soul Overlord was a perfected existence. How could he be knocked flying by a punch from this puppet? Was he still a puppet? Could he be the ancestor of all puppets? How domineering. After knocking Sloth Great Soul Overlord away with a punch, Xiao Bai swung his arms. Bam! Suddenly, thousands of rays of purple light shot out of his back. His speed exploded out, which was no less than Xiaopi's, and he sped tens of thousands of miles towards Sloth Great Soul Overlord. His huge palm grabbed towards Sloth Great Soul Overlord. Boom! Boom! Sloth Great Soul Overlord fought back instantly. He threw out countless attacks in a row and clashed with Xiao Bai. This puppet, I can't believe it. It was not so strong before, but it has become so strong in such a short time. And it eats the true forms of soul demons. It is the real nemesis of soul demons, and it is even more detestable than that chef. Break! Sloth Great Soul Overlord bellowed. The battle went on and on. In the starry sky, the two of them exchanged punches. The ripples from every single punch caused the void to tremble and shatter. It was shocking and terrifying. Bufong did not pay attention to it. He looked indifferently at the soul god. The latter's palm was blocked by the black turtle constellation walk, but he did not seem to give up. He threw out one palm after another, each of which was no weaker than the blow of a perfected expert. The black turtle constellation walk kept shaking. Bufong was very calm. The soul god's foot was gradually pulling out of the cosmic barrier. Then, Bufong's heart skipped a beat. Suddenly, a fierce azure tiger swooped down like a tiger descending a mountain. The white tiger heaven stove suppressed heaven and earth. He had undergone a major change. Bufong's state of mind had changed, and so had his control over the god of cooking sets. In the past, they were dependent on each other. But now, Bufong simply used the god of cooking sets as weapons. Bam! The white tiger heaven stove smashed hard on the soul god's featureless face. His foot, which was about to be pulled out, immediately shrank back a little. In the distance, the almighty experts of the primitive universe, who were fighting against the lightning punishment of the will of the great path and watching the battle, felt relieved. The soul god threw the stove away with a slap and pulled his foot out a little more. The almighty experts of the primitive universe felt their hearts skip a beat. Stepping on the stove, Bufong smashed it down again. The soul god's foot shrank back again. He pulled it out and thrust it in. He pulled it out and thrust it in. The hearts of the almighty experts of the primitive universe rose and fell. Tong Tian felt so uncomfortable that he almost vomited blood. However, he could not say anything. After all, he could only rely on Bufong now. The battle between Sloth Great Soul, Overlord, and Shao Bai was very fierce. Countless stars were broken, and the starry sky was torn into chaotic nothingness. It was shocking, but what was more exciting was it was still the dispute between Bufong and the soul god. He pulled it out a little more, and thrust it in a little more. The scene was too exciting. He clenched his fists. The power of the great sins gathered. They turned into numerous shadows. Their auras were extremely terrifying, and each of them had the strength of a great soul overlord. They shot toward Bufong. They wanted to stop Bufong. Bufong frowned. He snapped his fingers. Around him, one stinking stargazy pie after another appeared in the air. With a flick of his fingers, the stargazy pie flew out. They collided with the great soul overlords condensed of the power of the great sins and exploded. Bufong's vermilion robe flapped noisily. Soul God was furious to the extreme. He had almost King come out of there. He kept rubbing against the cosmic barrier. He was so anxious. Roar. Bufong frowned. He sensed the pressure coming from Soul God. Bufong even felt that he could not suppress it. His strength was still a little too weak. Little Hu turned into a stream of light and flew toward him. She lay on Xiaopi's back, her mouth bulging. Little Hu spat at the soul god. One golden soul meatball after another fell, making the soul god furious. The almighty experts of the primitive universe were so anxious that their minds were in a whirl. But there was nothing they could do. The will of the great path restrained them, so they did not dare to act recklessly. All of a sudden, Bufong paused. He saw a tiny, twisted shadow emerge from Soul God's face and shoot out of it at high speed. Oh! Bufong frowned. It was a figure. She sped through the universe, approaching Bufong step by step. Who is it? Bufong paused. Then, his pupils constricted slightly. He recognized her. It was the cursed goddess Soul. Why is she here? Soul's aura fluctuated, and the power of the great sins swirled around her. She stared at Bufong with hatred. Get out of here, you stinking chef, she growled. Her hair was disheveled, and she was extremely irritable. Her eyes were scarlet. Rings of the power of the great sins kept spreading and seeping into her bones and soul. Bufong paused. His Excellency wants to come out, and no one can stop him. Soul opened her mouth and let out a shrill cry. Then, Bufong's expression flickered slightly. He had a bad premonition in his heart, sure enough. Cursed Goddess Soul was filled with madness. Your Excellency, you must come out. Soul murmured in the midst of countless terrifying energies. As she got closer and closer to Bufong, The power of the great sins in her became stronger and stronger. Boom! The next moment, a rumbling sound rang out. It exploded all of a sudden. An invisible blast burst out in an instant. In the explosion, Soul's body gradually turned blurry and finally turned into ashes. Bufong's pupils constricted. The black turtle constellation walk floated up and blocked the explosion. However, the shockwave of the explosion was so violent that it knocked Bufong flying backward. This woman is crazy. The corner of Bufong's mouth twitched. She actually chose to self-destruct. She would never be able to reincarnate. Suddenly, Bufong's pupils constricted. Oh no! Chapter 1806. Oh no! Bufong's expression flickered slightly. He did not expect that Soul would choose to blow herself up to open a gap. The 6 great soul overlords had blown themselves up, and now Soul was blowing herself up as well. These are all existences who are very close to Soul God. Doesn't she feel sorry for them at all? Bufong's face was unsightly. He steadied himself, took a deep breath, and looked into the distance. There, Soul God finally broke free from the barrier of the universe. He was like a fish that had jumped out of the pond and into the vast ocean. Rumble. The whole primitive universe seemed to shake violently at this moment. Tong Tian's expression changed dramatically, and the faces of the other almighty experts of the primitive universe turned extremely unsightly. Had they failed to stop it in the end? In Hangu Pass, with a horsetail whisk in hand, the Taoist body erupted with a boundless aura that enveloped the entire Hangu Pass and blocked the terrifying aura that was constantly descending. Hutu, Sun Wukong, and countless immortals and deities stared blankly at the sky. Heaven and earth were trembling, and a terrifying haze was rapidly spreading out, causing everyone's hearts to pound with fear. It was as if some terrifying entity had just stepped into this part of the world. The calamity has begun. Taishang Laojuan's face was gloomy. He sighed, flicked his horsetail whisk, and shook his head. They had failed in the end. All the almighty experts of the primitive universe had come together, but they still could not stop the great demon from the soul demon universe. Next, all the living beings were going to be plunged into misery and suffering. Everyone, get ready for a battle of life and death. Rumble. Taishang Laojuan's voice resounded through the whole world. The immortals and deities in Hangu Pass all turned pale. Then, a look of determination came over everyone's face. They could not avoid it in the end. Hutu's face was unsightly, and Duchess Nightmare sighed. Even with Bufong, that chef, we still failed. This may be the general trend of the universe, and it cannot be stopped. Duchess Nightmare shook her head. The primitive universe's great path, did it turn a blind eye to all this? Was it really so ruthless? It was said that the great path was ruthless, but it was indifferent to the crisis of life and death. What was the use of leaving such a heavenly Tao behind? Bufong's face darkened. Cursed goddess Soul's self-destruction was beyond his expectation. After all, he did not think that Soul would blow herself up. Perhaps the Soul God would stop her from exploding. But nothing at all. Soul God could only watch as she blew herself up. In fact, Soul's self-detonation was bewitched by the Soul God. Bufong knew this very well, including the 6 great soul overlords. Once they self-destructed, even if Soul God managed to break free, he would not be able to save them from the void. The death of self-detonation was the annihilation of even the soul. Even if he used Almighty to reform it, it would no longer be Soul, but someone else. Bufong could feel Soul's attachment to Soul God. However, this attachment became the main culprit behind Soul's death. Although Bufong didn't like Soul very much, but this kind of death still made him sigh. Soul God was ruthless. The primordial heavenly Tao was also heartless. Perhaps, in order to become a ruler of this level, one had to be emotionless. Only by being ruthless could one reach the top. Bufong frowned. He was a little confused. If the goal was really ruthless, it was contrary to the path he had chosen. Would he really be able to reach the top on this path? Roar! There was no time for Bufong to think for too long. The soul god had finally broken free. Sloth Great Soul Overlord burst out laughing, his eyes filled with excitement. Rumble. He and Xiao Bai exchanged a blow, causing heaven and earth to tremble. Xiao Bai's purple eyes flashed, and his body trembled slightly. Using the force, Sloth sped forward and came to the soul god's side. "Your Excellency," Sloth said excitedly. The soul god stood in the starry sky. He was enormous, towering like thousands of stars. He turned his faceless head slightly and looked at Sloth. In the distance, the army of soul demons roared excitedly. Every soul demon had a look of excitement on his face. Their god had finally descended. This part of the world would soon become their territory under their conquest. The soul god raised his hand. His mind was a little muddled, or rather, his was a little vague. His body slowly shrank until it was the same size as when they first met in Void City. However, this time, he had an extra lower body. He had a pair of legs. Although he was still one-armed and faceless, he had an extra lower body. What he lacked now was his head, right arm, and his heart. The rumbling of the great path gradually weakened. Perhaps the soul god's appearance had attracted the attention of the will of the great path. After all, the soul god's power far exceeded that of this world. Tong Tian, Yuan Shi, Tianzuan, and the others breathed sighs of relief. The pressure brought by the will of the great path had disappeared. However, their hearts were even heavier than before, because the soul god had descended into this universe. Sizzle. The great path turned into a purple dragon, twisted around the soul god, and rushed toward him. Before this, the soul god was only crossing the barrier between the two universes and was not locked down by the will of the great path. However, as soon as he stepped into the primitive universe, the will of the great path locked down on him. However, the soul god raised his faceless head. The power of the great sins exploded out of him. At this moment, he was much stronger than when he was crossing the barrier between the universes. Bam! 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 The 7 hourglasses exploded one after another. The barrier between the universes disappeared. The power of the great sins in Soul God's arm was drawn out, turned into a black spear, and collided with the purple lightning dragon transformed from the heavenly Tao. Boom! A power that surpassed the chaotic energy surged and collapsed the void. The expressions of many experts changed dramatically. The soul god looked up at the great path in the sky and seemed to be sneering. "You are the primitive universe's great path, and I am the soul demon universe's will. To tell you the truth, you are one level higher than me. However, you are the great path, and you are ruthless. You are in charge of the order of heaven and earth, and the replacement of the living beings in the universe has nothing to do with you," the soul god said. His voice seemed to be covered by a thick, invisible veil. It was the voice produced by the soul vibration. The expressions of all the experts in the universe changed. The replacement of the living beings? Damn it, how arrogant. Tongtian's face was unsightly. "You're talking nonsense," he bellowed at the soul god. The next moment, he raised his hand. Buzz, the immortal slaughtering sword array, rose with a rumble, wrapped in 4 beams of sword light, and shot toward the soul god. However, the soul god did not care at all. He was even indifferent. He stood where he was and let the sect leader hack at him, but he was not hurt at all. The power of the great sins swept out. The 4 swords flew backward and smashed into the void. What do you think the great path is? He is also the manifestation of the will of an expert. Perhaps countless years ago, he watched you grow up with a gentle smile. But what about now? He is indifferent to your life and death. You fight to the death to protect the universe, but the great path only obeys the rules. The soul god laughed. This is destiny. This is the final path of all experts. To stand at the top of the universe, one has to be ruthless, even if the price of being ruthless is loneliness. The soul god said. The clouds the great path had transformed into gradually dispersed. The soul god raised his faceless face. The next moment, he pointed his arm at the distant void. That place was Hangu Pass, the vast and boundless primordial wasteland. Yuanshi Tianzuan's expression flickered. The expressions of the Buddha and Lady Nuwa also flickered. They naturally could not allow this to happen. Rumble. Their auras fluctuated. Yuanshi Tianzuan held the heaven-splitting axe. Boundless chaotic energy swirled in front of it. Lady Nuwa's eyes lit up, and the light of merit erupted. The seven-colored divine stone burst into a dazzling light. The Buddha recited the Buddha's name. Behind him, countless Buddhas and Arhats emerged and turned into the thousand Buddha array. That huge bell let out a sound that shook the heavens and the earth. It's too late. The soul god's hoarse voice rang out. Bufang frowned. What soul god said just now made him fall in a deep thought. To become the strongest, one must be ruthless. Was this the path of the soul god? The primitive universe's great path was also the manifestation of the will of the experts, and it was also ruthless. The same path? Bufang exhaled. He felt a little depressed. The strongest attacks of the almighty experts of the primitive universe rushed toward the soul god. He did not belong to the primitive universe. However, his level of existence was too high. Although he had not fully gathered his fleshly body, he was already at the peak of the perfected realm. He was unscathed by such an attack. Despair. The immortals and deities in Hangu Pass were in despair. Soul God's power of the great sin spread. It blotted out the sky. Yuanshi, Tianzuan, and the others immediately struggled to resist it. This power was not weaker than the power of the great path. A soul god, who had not yet fully formed, had suppressed them like this. How could they fight him? They felt helpless. Sloth Great Soul, Overlord laughed. After suppressing the almighty experts, he aimed at Hangu Pass again. He ignored Bufang. Bufang was also lost in thought. Then, Soul Godzilla exploded out. It seemed to be summoning something. Rumble, the primitive universe began to shake. The earth crumbled, and a crack split from both sides, spreading and spreading. Hangu Pass trembled. In the center of Hangu Pass, a crack emerged and began to collapse to both sides. Countless rubble fell with a clatter. The immortals and deities in Hangu Pass were shocked. Good heavens! What's going to happen? Soul God raised his hand and waved it. Boom! The shattering of the primitive universe grew more and more violent. Rumble. It was as if something terrible was about to rush out of the primitive universe. Bufang was startled by the violent tremor. He turned to look and was slightly shocked. Xiaobai hovered beside him, his purple eyes flashing. Little Hu and Xiaopi were lying on his shoulders. The primitive universe was crumbling, floods were rushing, and mountains were crumbling. It was as if the world was about to be destroyed. In the primitive universe, the saints of the Great Path who guarded the cities unleashed their auras and resisted the attack of the catastrophe with their great magic power. In the celestial court, the celestial emperor spoke. Heavenly soldiers and generals entered the primitive universe to resist the catastrophe. However, this resistance was futile. As the earth kept tearing apart, a terrible power erupted. It was the true destruction of the world. Soul God's aura was trembling. It was an excitement that he was about to return. Oh! Suddenly, Bufang froze. In the distance, the primitive universe, a terrible rumble of the Great Path, emerged. That gave Soul God pause. Tom Tian, Yuanshi Tiandian, Lady Nuwa, and the other almighty experts were all stunned. Over there, a colossal shadow appeared, its feet on the ground and its head reaching the sky. It propped up the chaos space and tore apart the void. His burly body supported the collapsing primordial world. Who is it? The eyes of Yuanshi, Tianzuan, and the other experts flashed. Bufang was horrified. This aura is really fearsome, Pangu ancestor god. In Hangu Pass, all the immortals and deities were pleasantly surprised. Swoosh, the will of the heavenly Great Path turned into chains and entangled the body of the indomitable and powerful being. The chains intertwined, locking up the crumbling earth and the exploding starry sky. The eyes of the indomitable figure burst into bright light. He looked straight into the sky and approached Soul God. You still want to suppress me? My return is unstoppable. Soul God roared. The void exploded. His power of the great sins turned into fine black threads and shot out. They pierced through the bodies of one soul demon after another. Sloth Great Soul, Overlord froze. A ripping sound rang out. His forehead was pierced by a long tentacle that had burst out of Soul God's body. Gurgle, gurgle, the soul demon's true form began to wither. Countless strands of energy flowed through the long tentacle and poured into Soul God's body. Soul God's aura suddenly soared. The vast amount of energy made his aura seem to burst apart this part of the world. Thousands of soul demons' true forms danced wildly in Soul God's body. Facing the vast primitive universe in the distance, Soul God suddenly fell to his knees. Bam! He knelt. Panga's shadow trembled slightly. Even the chains formed by the great path were shattered. Amidst the shattered earth, a huge head with its eyes closed suddenly drilled out from the shattered earth with a bang. Chapter 1807. Rumble. As soon as the huge head appeared, heaven and earth trembled violently. The head broke out of the primitive universe, emanating a terrible pressure that made the hearts of all who looked at it constricted and made them breathless. That was Soul God's head, the head that was sealed in the primitive universe. The hearts of many experts were filled with shock. The chains transformed from the will of the great path continued to fall, clattering as they struck the head of the Soul God, who had just emerged from the primitive earth, causing violent fluctuations. He wanted to seal the head again. Soul God's tightly closed head was like a demon. If he was allowed to come out, it would lead to the destruction of the world. The Soul God had absorbed the power of countless soul demons, even the power of Sloth Great Soul Overlord, who was a perfected Great Soul Overlord. At this moment, he had gathered almost all the terrible power of the soul demon universe. He wanted to use this power to gather his body back. Rumble. The head began to rise into the sky. The chains transformed from the will of the great path were suppressing it, but they still could not completely suppress it. Soul God roared. Although he was faceless, his aura was fluctuating. The power of the great sins seemed to be boiling as it kept pressing toward the head, trying to free it from the chains. The aura of the towering figure was fluctuating, but he was, after all, just a will projection. It held up the sky and the earth, but it could not stop Soul God's body from returning. Tong Tian, Yuan Shi Tianzuan, and the other almighty experts struck out. All kinds of magical means rushed into the sky. At this moment, they could no longer care about the restraint of the will of the great path. Even if they had to bury their bodies, they had to suppress the soul demon's head. Bu Fong hovered in midair, holding the pseudo-god of cooking dish in one hand. He frowned at Soul God. It was like a tug-of-war between the experts of the primitive universe and Soul God. The movement of the head was the definitive point of the final result of the tug-of-war. The movement of the head was the definitive point of the final result of the tug-of-war. Rumble. Soul God's power was too strong. As the head moved, it caused the primitive universe to crumble. Countless people, including countless immortals and deities, were watching the battle. Many could not intervene and could only watch from afar. They knew what it would mean if they lost. However, they didn't have enough strength, so they could only stare blankly. Little Hu and Xiaopi also joined the battle of strength. In the void, only Bu Fong and Xiao Bai were left floating in the air. Without Bu Fong's order, Xiao Bai would not participate in any competition. After a long time, Bu Fong exhaled. It was impossible for him to stand by and watch this battle. He also had no reason to do so. Who cares about the heartless path? Bu Fong had walked his own path. Bu Fong stepped on the void. He took a step forward. The wills of the god of cooking sets poured out. He transformed into his true form and joined the camp. With the addition of the artifact spirit, the battle became neck and neck. The Soul God and the experts of the primitive universe were in a stalemate. Boom, boom, boom. The starry sky seemed to tremble. Behind Soul God, black smoke billowed, and the power of the great sins surged like a monstrous torrent. The power of tens of thousands of soul demons gathered, making Soul God stronger and stronger. He had been asleep for too long, and his body had been suppressed for too long. Now that he had returned, he needed to slowly adapt to this power. When he returned to heaven and earth, he would be everyone's nightmare. Roar! The power of the one-armed Soul God exploded out. Suddenly, the chain lashed out. A crashing sound rang out. The faces of many experts of the primitive universe flickered. A thick chain formed from the will of the heavenly Tao lashed down and smashed into the Hanga Pass, causing it to explode. It was as if someone had cut it in half. Bufang's expression changed slightly. He took a step forward. Then, he landed on Hanga Pass. He raised his hand and grabbed the huge chain. The power in his arm exploded out, and with a clattering sound, he yanked the chain backward. Soul God seemed to notice Bufang, and he let out a deafening roar. Damned chef! Soul God's voice was full of resentment and anger. Those words, that tone, even Bufang could not help but frown. Xiaobai landed and helped Bufang pull the chain. The battle continued. In the distance, the towering figure slowly began to disappear. After all, it was the manifestation of the will, which itself had turned into the primitive universe and fed it. As the ancestor god disappeared, the primordial universe's side gradually lost their competitiveness and began to be constantly pulled back. Soul God's head left the ground and floated in the air. Wrapped in the power of the great sins, it floated towards Soul God. It was getting closer and closer. Closer and closer. Everyone could only watch helplessly. Even experts as powerful as Yuanshi Tianzuan and Lady Nuwa could only watch helplessly. Soul God's level was the primitive universe's great path, and the ancestor god's level. They could not touch him yet. Therefore, they could do nothing. Despair enveloped the whole primitive universe in a flash and spread to the whole primitive universe. Rumble! The head flew into the starry sky. It flew out of Hanga Pass and resonated with Soul God from a distance. There seemed to be a force of attraction erupting in the dark, attracting Soul God. Soul God was finally going to catch it. Bufang heaved a long sigh. Carrying the dish, his figure sped away at high speed. Following a chain wrapped around Soul God's head, it sped away at high speed. Then he sped towards Soul God. No one knew what Bufang was going to do, and no one thought Bufang could stop Soul God. After all, Bufang's cultivation base was too weak. He had just become a chaotic saint. How could he stop Soul God? Bufang seemed to be well aware of this, but he still went forward without hesitation. As Bufang sped away, the artifact spirits of the god of cooking sets emerged one after another. Rumble! The white tiger ran wildly beside Bufang. The divine dragon and the vermilion bird flew over Bufang's head. The Qilin stood proudly in the sky, while the black turtle floated in the starry sky. At this moment, Bufang was like a dazzling star in the sky. Chef, you can't stop me. Soul God roared. You couldn't stop me before, and you can't stop me now. Swoosh! The chain was suddenly pulled back. The flying speed of the severed head suddenly increased. A head streaked across the starry sky in a beautiful arc and fell towards Soul God's fleshly body. Finally, with a rumble, it fell on Soul God's head. Crack! A deafening noise rang out, making one's hair stand on end. His entire head was forcefully twisted by his arm, completely straightening it. Then its tightly closed eyes opened. Boom! Bufang, who was close to Soul God, was immediately pushed back several steps by the terrible pressure that erupted from the chaotic god who had opened his eyes. Even the system's built-in ability to reduce the pressure could not help him withstand it. He's so strong. Bufang was shocked. Soul God, this is Soul God, who is close to his complete form. Rumble! In the sky above the untainted land, layers of purple clouds were rolling. Amidst the purple clouds, a colossal Taoist seemed to emerge, shrouded in the will of the great path. A terrible pressure confronted Soul God from a distance. It was not weak at all. However, Soul God ignored it and just burst out laughing. His laughter resounded throughout the universe. The Soul Demon God is finally back. Soul God let out a long roar. Countless stars in the starry sky exploded and shattered in the primitive universe. All the immortals and deities were silent. Xiaopi and Little Hu were hovering in the starry sky in silence. With a head, Soul God's temperament was completely different. Every time he had a body, his strength increased tremendously. With his head back, he could now fight against the primitive universe's great path, even without absorbing all the Soul Demon's power. Boom! Outside the primitive universe, in the vast starry sky, a crashing sound rang out. The water parted. It seemed to be boiling, and as it surged, it gradually turned from blue to black. Then, a demon arm emerged from it, flew into the starry sky, and gathered with Soul God's body. Flesh and blood kept wriggling where the body was connected to the arm, which seemed to be the manifestation of tiny wisps of the power of the great sins. Soul God's body became stronger and stronger, and in the end, it even seemed to have turned into a body of energy. A terrible mental pressure swept across the universe. Everyone's heart sank. Bufang ran slower and slower until he stood on the chain. The chain was connected to Soul God's neck. The corners of Soul God's mouth parted slightly, revealing a wicked smile. He raised the arm that had just gathered and yanked the chain. Then he pulled. The chain was torn to pieces in an instant. The chain turned into specks of light and dissipated. Hovering in the starry sky, Bufang looked at Soul God from a distance. The two of them stared at each other. Feeling the pressure, Bufang could not help but summon the god of cooking's eye. What a disgusting pair of eyes, Soul God said. Suddenly, he raised both hands. In his huge palms, the power of the great sins kept gathering. Finally, it turned into a spinning vortex. With a flick of his fingers, the vortex sped toward the starry sky. Rumble. Bufang's pupils constricted. All the experts sucked in a cold breath. The vortex spun. In the blink of an eye, an entire patch of the void collapsed in the collapsed nothingness. A path of stars emerged. It was a twisted path of stars, and energy fluctuated. Bufang's pupils constricted, and he stared at it. The next moment, his whole body shook. Inside the rotating crack, a blue star floated. The corners of Soul God's mouth twitched slightly. "It's time to get my heart back," he said. Rumble. Just then, at this moment, 3 figures sat cross-legged in the rift. The leader was holding a bone and pointing it at Soul God. Bufang recognized them. Many experts of the primitive universe fell silent. Bufang recognized the 3 of them. The many experts of the primitive universe fell silent. Now who could stop Soul God? Who could stop Soul God now? They could not stop him. No one had expected that Soul God's heart was sealed on Earth. Perhaps that was why the Soul Demons invaded Earth. Soul God did not care about the 3 who tried to stop him. Their wills were respectable, but Soul God was too strong, especially him, who had almost completed his body. Perhaps his only weakness was his heart. Rumble. I can't let him get the heart, Bufang thought to himself. As soon as the idea came to his mind, it surged uncontrollably. Bufang turned to look at Xiaobai. Xiaobai's purple eyes flashed as if he understood. Then Xiaobai soared into the sky. Rumble. Blasts of air rushed out from behind him. The purple light exploded to the extreme. Buzz layers of purple energy wrapped Xiaobai's body like a veil. All of a sudden, Whitey turned into a blur and charged toward the Soul God. Bufang took a deep breath. He turned to look at the dish in his hand. Perhaps this pseudo-god of cooking dish was the only way to stop Soul God. Xiaopi, Bufang murmured. In the distance, Xiaopi, who was standing with Little Hu, suddenly turned into a beam of golden light and shot toward him. Bufang jumped out and landed on Xiaopi's back. Then he turned into a beam of golden light and followed Xiaobai toward Soul God. Soul God's hand was almost touching the rift. Sueren's eyes narrowed and the veins on his hand bulged. However, they all froze and turned to look in Bufang's direction. "It's that boy," Sueren heaved a sigh. Soul God, on the other hand, sneered indifferently. He continued to thrust his palm toward Earth and took out Soul God's heart sealed in its center. Even if Xiao Bai and Bu Fong worked together, they were no match for Soul God. The god of cooking was missing, the cursed goddess was asleep, and the great path of the primitive universe had bound him. Soul God was invincible now. His level of life was above everyone else. Boom! As Xiao Bai sped forward, the purple light around him exploded to the extreme. Suddenly, a formidable will erupted from Xiao Bai's body. Soul God's calm expression changed. Oh, damn guy! Xiao Bai suddenly turned into a ball of purple light, moving at extreme speed. The god of cookings will envelop Xiao Bai like a ball of blazing light. Slash! Xiao Bai, who had turned into the god of cooking's will, rushed out. In an instant, it pierced Soul God's chest. A huge hole appeared in his chest. Soul God let out a furious roar. The god of cooking's will. He never thought that White E's puppet body contained the god of cooking's damned will. The purple light propped up Soul God's wound. Xiaopi arrived in a flash on Bu Fong's back. Bu Fong's hair floated in the air. He raised his hand. Immediately, the pseudo-god of cooking dish, the mountain and river map, floated in midair. It looked like a small universe. However, it was not enough. It was far from enough. What are you doing? Soul God growled. Bu Fong glanced indifferently at Soul God. The next moment, the corners of his mouth twitched. Don't you want a heart? Then I'll give you a heart. Are you surprised? Bu Fong said. As soon as he finished speaking, Bu Fong's will exploded. Rumble. A huge mental force surged out. The starry sky spirit sea moved out and formed a small world. The true form of his divine sense opened its eyes. The god of cooking's menu was over its head, and the mountain and river map was in its hand. The true form of Bu Fong's divine sense walked step by step. It stepped into Soul God's chest. Bu Fong's face was pale. The true form of his divine sense left his body. His aura was falling at a rate visible to the naked eye. His aura, which was originally at the level of chaotic saint, fell to the level of a saint of the great path, and kept falling. It kept falling. A drop of golden blood emerged from between his brows. It was the god of cooking's blood. When the blood emerged, Bu Fong's cultivation base had fallen to the bottom. However, he didn't care about any of this. He used the golden god of cooking's blood to activate the gourmet arrays. One gourmet array after another suppressed the void around Soul God's body. Soul God's furious roar shook the sky. He wanted his heart back. In the end, Bu Fong took the dish as his heart and stuffed it into Soul God's chest. Rumble. Soul God's body began to contract. It was as if he was being sucked by a tremendous suction force. The gourmet arrays, compression, sealing. In the end, Soul God, whose aura was so magnificent that it could suppress the heavens, had just come out for a breath of fresh air for less than 3 seconds. Then he was suppressed again, this time inside a dish. Heaven and earth were silent. Everyone was dumbfounded. Only a dish was left floating in the starry sky. Chapter 1808. The starry sky was filled with dust. All that was left was silence and chaos after a great battle. The sound of soft breathing rang out, as if it would stop at any moment. Every breath was very weak. In the void, a dark dish floated. Black and golden light swirled over it, entangling as if they wanted to break free from each other. The dish was like a world, where the most terrible demon in the world was sealed. A puppet floated behind the dish. The puppet was broken. Cracks had appeared on every part of its iron skin, and there were arcs of energy dancing in the cracks. Xiao Bai's mechanical eyes were dim, no longer as fierce as before. The god of cooking set, the dragon bone kitchen knife, the black turtle constellation walk, the vermilion robe, the white tiger heaven stove, and the Chilean transmigration ladle had lost their luster and looked simple and dark. Bu Fong sat on Xiaopi's back. His face was pale. The velvet rope that tied his hair was broken, and his hair hung loose. His aura had dropped to ordinary, almost ordinary. His spirit sea was stripped away, and his divine sense had a corporeal body to suppress Soul God. Today, Bu Fong seemed to have lost all his cultivation base and returned to being immortal. He did not have to do this. He was not a savior, and he did not have the heart to save the world. But he had to do it. Consider it a debt repayment. Bu Fong exhaled, looking at the dish hovering in the starry sky with a complicated look in his eyes. Debt repayment? Bu Fong did not know what debt he was going to repay. However, after sealing Soul God this time, the shackles in his heart seemed to have completely disappeared. He felt a sense of relaxation that he had not felt for a long time. It was just like when he was kicked into a different world. Xiaopi, take me down, Bu Fong said weakly. Xiaopi blew a bubble, turned into a beam of golden light, flashed, and disappeared into the void. All that was left was a slight ripple in the void. Hanggu Pass was broken in half by the chains of the Great Path, and countless immortals and deities hovered above it. The golden light faded. Xiaopi landed with Bu Fong. Everyone's gazes turned and landed on him. There was no movement from Soul God. What happened? What the hell happened? At that moment, it wasn't just the immortals and gods. Even Tong Tian, Yuan Shi, Tianzuan, and the other mighty figures were dumbfounded. They were all prepared to fight to the death. But what happened? The insufferably arrogant Soul God was suddenly suppressed in the void. The passage to Earth had also disappeared. At the end of the tunnel, the three sovereigns stared at Bu Fong as he slowly disappeared. Everyone was confused. In the void, the pseudo-god of cooking dish, cooked by Bu Fong, slowly floated in the air, emanating a vast amount of energy, while an even more terrible aura was brewing in the depths of the dish. No one dared to touch it. That dish sealed Soul God. The Tong Tian sect leader narrowed his eyes in confusion. Bu Fong nodded weakly. His aura and cultivation base were still declining. He was falling every second. From a high and mighty, chaotic saint, he had now fallen to a demigod, and this was not the end of his fall. He was still falling. After a long time, his aura fell to the divine realm and remained at the level of a ninth-grade supremacy. Only then did it slow down. Even though it had fallen to the level of supremacy, it did not slow down. Of course, Bu Fong's fleshly body was still strong, but his cultivation base was gone. You can seal Soul God? The sect leader still could not believe it. After all, Bu Fong had just become a chaotic saint. The soul demon hates my dish, and Soul God is also a soul demon. He hasn't condensed a heart. In fact, he's still a little bit away from the ancestral god realm. This gives me a chance, Bu Fong said faintly. His voice grew weaker and weaker, as if it would fade away at any moment. The sect leader was taken aback and stopped asking questions. He took out many divine pills and medicines and handed them to Bu Fong. Eat these pills first. We'll talk after you've recovered. Bu Fong waved his hand. No matter how strong your pills are they as strong as my dishes? Bu Fong said. The sect leader was speechless. He's so weak, but he still doesn't forget to show off. It was not that Bu Fong was being pretentious, but he knew his situation very well. The last wave of energy he unleashed basically vented everything the system had cultivated him for so many years. The will of the god of cooking in Shao Bai had also burned. He had suppressed Soul God with the will of the god of cooking. Otherwise, even if Bu Fong unleashed his power, it would be useless. Now, Soul God has been sealed, but this seal won't last long. In 1,000 years at most, he will break the seal again. After all, I'm not the god of cooking. I'm still too weak, Bu Fong said. He beckoned to the distance. Little Hu flew over with Xiao Bai in his arms and landed on Xiaopi's shoulder. Xiao Bai's mechanical eyes were dim, and his aura was as weak as Bu Fong's. Bu Fong sighed as he touched Xiao Bai's iron skin. The primeval Lord of Heaven, Goddess Niwa, and other experts flew over. They were all silent. Goddess Nviwa raised her rainbow-colored divine sense and threw the rainbow-colored divine stone down. Boundless vitality surged, trying to help Bu Fong recover. Goddess Nviwa cried out in alarm. She realized that the divine light of the rainbow godstone could not help Bu Fong. How could this be? The seven-color divine stone was a supreme treasure. Even if there was only a drop of blood left, it could help you regenerate. She had never encountered such a situation before. Bu Fong waved his hand. His current situation was a little complicated. Sealing Soul God was tantamount to sealing himself. No one could help him. The current Bufong could be considered as immortal. There will always be a way, Tong Tian said. Many immortals and deities of the primitive universe approached Bufong and tried to persuade Bufong. Sun Wukong, Hutu, Duchess Nightmare, etc. Of course, persuasion was useless. You'd better think about how to suppress Soul God. 1,000 years from now, I won't be able to help you, Bufong said. He looked up at the dish in the sky. It hovered in the starry sky, forming a world of its own. It was surrounded by a terrifying domain that would seriously injure or kill anyone who approached it. However, one could see that the domain was shaking and melting bit by bit. Although the process was very slow, it would eventually be completely melted. Bufong's words startled Tong Tian and the others. Yes, the problem of Soul God had not been completely solved. The Great Path had dispersed. No one knew if it was intentional or not. When Bufong unleashed his aura to seal Soul God, Bufong vaguely heard a sigh from the Taoist transformed from the Great Path. Tong Tian, Yuan Shi, Tianzun, Goddess Nviwa, Shrouding Buddha, and other experts rushed into the starry sky. Each of them had a serious look on their faces. They unleashed their supreme power. Each of them used their treasures as a medium to set up sealing formations around the dish, stacking layers upon layers of formations around it. Tong Tian's face was even more serious. They had gathered the power of tens of thousands of immortals to set up arrays to suppress the dish. Although Bufong had said that the dish could suppress Soul God for 1,000 years, what if he came out ahead of time? At Hangapass, Bufong looked up at the busy immortals and deities. He breathed a sigh of relief. The corners of his mouth twitched slightly on his expressionless face. "Let's go, Xiaopi," Bufong said. He stroked Xiaopi's head. Little Hu, holding Xiao by in his arms, followed behind Bufong. Huda seemed to sense something. She turned her head and looked over. She found that Bufong had disappeared. Even Little Hu and Xiao Bai. They left quietly, not taking a single cloud with them. Huta paused. Where was Bufong going? After this battle, no one knew where Bufong had gone. In the chaotic universe, Lord Go lay in the temple of Heaven God Time and looked up at the sky. Hades Era leaned against the wall and looked up with Lord Go. Suddenly, both of them shuddered. In the sky, two beams of light sped past. Little Hu and Xiaopi appeared and landed in the chaos. Lord Go couldn't help but twitch his mouth. It's these two little guys. Lord Go couldn't help but want to roll his eyes. This is bad. Of the 5 heaven gods of the chaotic universe, 3 had reincarnated as animals. 1 had become a traitor, and the last one was a retard. This had completely destroyed their majesty as heaven gods. Where's Bufong? Lord Go narrowed his eyes and looked at Little Hu and Xiaopi. Hades Era also changed his joking manner and became very serious. Little Hu and Xiaopi shook their heads at the same time, indicating that they did not know. You don't know? Lord Go's expression flickered. The battle in the primitive universe was so violent. Although Lord Go and Hades Era had not experienced it themselves, they could deduce it. Bufong has disappeared. After a long time, Lord Go breathed a sigh of relief. His face was full of loneliness. Hades Era also covered his head with his hands, looking shocked. Bufong, young man, eloped with that white lump. Lord Go glanced at Hades Era and rolled his eyes. In Void City, the little lowly Kersey was sitting on the stone stairs of the palace, swinging her fair little legs. Behind her was the queen's palace. Xiao Ai walked outside and sat down next to Kersey. Her Excellency Nethery is in seclusion again. Kersey nodded and hummed a song. The queen's inheritance has begun. When you come out of seclusion, we may be able to see the Queen of Curses return to heaven and earth. The little lowly cursed. Is it dangerous? Xiao Ai asked worriedly. Is it dangerous to inherit the queen's will? Kersey paused and shook her head. How can not be dangerous? The queen's obsession is very terrifying. Xiao Ai paused. Little girl, do you know what the queen's obsession is? Kersey said, swinging her legs and smiling. She looked very cute. She did not know. She was worried about you now. The queen's obsession is to choose between life and death. The furthest distance in the world is between life and death. Where was Bufong? No one knew. In a remote starry sky in the primitive universe, it was a newborn planet with lives. The clouds had dispersed, and the surface of the planet was covered with endless forests and boundless oceans. The level of the planet with lives was not high, and the spiritual energy of heaven and earth was not rich. In a remote mountain village under a bustling city, picking chrysanthemums under the eastern fence, one could see the southern mountain leisurely. The air after the rain was very fresh. The door of the wooden hut was pushed open. A thin figure in shabby linen clothes walked out of the hut. Behind the figure was a lump of metal. The light in the lump of metal's eyes was dim. Its aura was weak. Bufong took a deep breath, holding a bowl of fragrant white rice in his hand. Hee, Bufong said. Then, behind the wooden hut, a plump 8 treasures chicken ran over while twisting its butt. The corner of Bufong's mouth twitched slightly as he handed 80 a bowl of plain white rice. Although it was a very ordinary rice, 80 ate it with relish. It was fed to 80. Bufong returned to the wooden hut, took a hoe, put on a bamboo hat, a straw raincoat, and a pair of worn-out cloth shoes. Then, he left the wooden hut and walked toward the muddy road. Whitey followed closely behind Bufong, with its iron skin flapping in the wind. The two of them disappeared into the thick fog of the mountains. Chapter 1809. This was a newborn planet with life, called Planet Immortality. Because the planet with life was formed relatively late and was limited by the spirit energy of heaven and earth, the entire planet only had legends of immortals and gods left behind in ancient times. There was no such thing as immortals and gods anymore. Countless descendants of the planet searched for the path of immortality and immortality, but in the end, they couldn't find it and died of old age. Later generations changed the name of the nameless planet to Planet Immortality. On the vast path of immortality, immortals could be found everywhere. The mountain road was a bit muddy after the rain. Soaked by the rain, the yellow soil became extremely wet and sticky, sticking to the soles of the feet and making the shoes that had just been changed dirty. Green leaves hung on both sides of the mountain road. Insects were gnawing on the leaves, and raindrops were condensing. Swish! The straw cape brushed past the leaves, and the leaves suddenly shook. Crystal clear water droplets fell from the leaves. The little insect was also scared and hugged the leaves tightly. Bufong carried the hoe and slowly went up the mountain step by step. On Planet Immortality, this mountain was located in a remote area. The ground was very slippery, and the wet soil always gave people a sense of emptiness, as if one would slide down the mountain with a little carelessness. Xiao Bai's iron skin was flying, and there was no light in his mechanical eyes. He quietly followed behind Bufong. He stepped down, and his iron foot sank deep into the ground. When he pulled it out, the yellow soil flew everywhere. Walk slowly. Bufong glanced at Xiao Bai, who was a little slow, and the corners of his mouth curled up slightly. After walking for a while, Bufong was a little out of breath. Right now, he was no different from a mortal. Even his physical body seemed to have returned to its original state. The mountain was very high, and the sun was already setting in the west. Bufong didn't want to waste any more time. Xiao Bai quickly climbed up using his hands and feet. Deep in the mountain, there were ferocious beasts and birds. However, although Bufong had returned to normal, his pressure hadn't disappeared. The ferocious beasts and birds didn't dare to come close to him. Swish, swish, the mountain stream flowed, and from far away, Bufong could smell the water vapor. He brought Xiao Bai over. The water in the mountain stream was incomparably clear. This was the clear water after the rain, and it was even sweeter. Bufong took out a clay pot and filled it with water. He shook the water a little. The water was very clear. There was no mud or sediment at all. Bufong was very satisfied and continued to go up. He was going to look for the ingredients for tonight's dinner. The tree was covered with mushrooms, some of which were poisonous. Bufong chose the mushrooms that were growing well and non-poisonous and threw them into the basket on his back. He continued to climb the mountain. Finally, he and Xiao Bai arrived at a bamboo forest. The pillars in the bamboo forest towered into the clouds, and the rustling of leaves could be heard as they rustled against each other. The ground was covered with bamboo leaves. Some of the bamboo leaves were rotten, and it had just rained, so the smell of decay was very strong. Xiao Bai didn't move and sat on the side. Bufong was used to it. Carrying the hoe, he stepped into the bamboo forest. He searched in the bamboo forest unhurriedly. Soon, he found a sprouting bamboo shoot and chopped down with his hoe. He dug the bamboo shoot out of the ground. Peeling off the soil, Bufong patted it and threw the bamboo shoot into the basket. Of course, he was not satisfied and continued to look for the bamboo shoots. The bamboo shoots that sprang up after the rain in this season were the best. The delicious food cooked was the most tempting. He found several bamboo shoots in a row. Bufong was a little out of breath. He leaned against the bamboo, took out a kettle, and drank a mouthful of water. The sweet water flowed down his throat and into his body, making his tired body feel much more comfortable. It was getting late. Bufong did not continue to look for it. He took Xiao Bai down the mountain. The food in the mountain was actually very rich and colorful. Humming a song, Bufong took Xiao Bai down the mountain. The mountain road was difficult to walk up, but the road down the mountain was very easy. Bufong's humming was very jerky and deliberate. Perhaps Bufong felt that it would be weird not to hum a song on such a lonely road. They returned to the house. The sky had become dark. Little Mina ran around the house, clucking and calling out. Bufong rubbed the little fellow's head, then took the ingredients and entered the room. Xiao Bai sat quietly at the side, its mechanical eyes not blinking. Adi ran over and seemed to communicate with Xiao Bai for a while. Then it felt that the metal was a little boring, so it twisted its chicken butt and ran away. Bufong walked out of the house again. In the yard, he built a simple stove. He lit the firewood that he had prepared yesterday. The smoke slowly rose in the hazy night. Adi ran over, squatted beside him, and stared blankly at the flame. It was not a divine fire, nor a flame that could destroy the world with a thought. This was an ordinary fire that rose from a simple firewood. But in this fire, Adi felt a throbbing. It was a throbbing that was born from a soul. Bufong did not care. He licked the firewood. At night, in the mountains, the temperature dropped sharply, and he felt a little cold. Only when he was cooking and felt the temperature brought by the fire would he feel warm. Xiao Bai sat in the distance. Under the reflection of the fire, he looked a little silly. Bufong shook his head. After a while, he warmed himself by the fire. Then, he took out the spring bamboo shoots that he had picked in the mountain. The spring bamboo shoots had an irregular inverted cone shape. He peeled off the outer skin, layer by layer, as if he was peeling off the clothes of the ingredients. The white and tender bamboo shoots appeared in front of him. After Bufong washed them again, he cut the spring bamboo shoots into small pieces. He heated the wok, boiled the water, blanched the ingredients, and stir-fried them. After a while, the spring bamboo shoots became a fragrant dish. In addition to the spring bamboo shoots, Bufong also made a bowl of mushroom soup. The slightly viscous mushroom soup, together with the shredded radish, presented a bright red color. He opened the steamer. Waves of hot air surged up. Bufong got a bowl of rice. He moved the bamboo table and chair and sat down. On the table, there was a dish, a bowl of soup, and a bowl of rice. Simple and plain. Little Eighth let out a goo-goo sound and ran away happily. Xiao Bai didn't need to eat, so he stared blankly at the distance. Bufong raised the corner of his mouth slightly. He leaned on the bamboo chair, which made a creaking sound. Around the house, the sound of insects and the rustling of leaves lingered in his ears. Although it was noisy, it didn't make him feel annoyed. This kind of quiet feeling made Bufong feel very comfortable. In the sky, because of the rain, the stars were shining and the stars were blinking. Sitting under the stars, eating a comfortable meal, Bufong couldn't imagine this kind of life in the past. His chopsticks fell, and picked up a piece of spring bamboo shoots. The spring bamboo shoots were white and tender. When it entered his mouth and bit down, it was extremely crispy, and the sweet taste spread in his mouth. Bufong narrowed his eyes and raised the corner of his mouth. Although it was just a simple spring bamboo shoot, its taste penetrated Bufong's heart. It was a dish that was different from what he had cooked in the past. He might not have the mighty cultivation base now, but his state of mind was getting calmer and calmer. He even felt that it was good to continue living like this. He swept away the dust and calmed his heart to experience heaven and earth. The true meaning could be seen in the ordinary. The comfort and ease of a bamboo stick and straw shoes were lighter than a horse. The calmness of a misty rain. Perhaps this was Bufong's state of mind at the moment. A few years ago, Bufong used his own cultivation base, the will that the god of cooking left in Xiao Bai's body, and a pseudo-god of cooking dishes. He sealed the newly born soul god and suppressed him for 1,000 years. This was the best Bufong could do. He was not the god of cooking. He was just a little chef who kept running on the road to becoming the god of cooking. He sacrificed his cultivation base and gave everything he had. However, many people didn't understand. Why did Bufong do this? When Soul God was born, the top experts of the primitive universe, for example, could still live. As long as they left the universe and hid in the endless void, even Soul God could not do anything to them, because it was impossible for Soul God to spend so much time searching for them in the boundless void. Many immortals and deities were prepared for this. If something happened to Soul God, they could escape into the void. Bufong could do the same. Even though Soul God hated Bufong very much, he still made such a choice. However, in the end, Bufong chose to seal Soul God. He fell to the mortal world and became immortal. He had jumped out of the transmigration, but now he had entered it again. Life, death, illness, and the seasons changed. He gave up everything magnificent and chose to live an ordinary mortal life. Perhaps he just wanted to calm his impetuous heart. The system had disappeared with Xiao Bai's god of cooking's will. Bufong was really just a mortal now. His spirit sea and divine sense left his body and chose to suppress Soul God. He could not use his mental force now, except for his body, which was stronger than that of a mortal and immune to all diseases. There was no difference. He would get tired, sweat, and have the 7 emotions and 6 desires of a mortal. He did not know where 80 had come from, but Bufong had no idea. Because he could not open the heaven and earth farmland, he did not know what was going on. Of course, it would not be destroyed. After Bufong released his cultivation base, he sent the farmland into the void of the universe. Now, it should have become a planet with lives again. It was even more terrifying than an ordinary planet with lives. It was a great world comparable to the chaotic universe. However, Bufong still did not understand why 80 appeared. Since he could not figure it out, Bufong did not want to think about it. Bufong would not give this little guy any treasures to eat, even if it appeared here. All 80 could eat was ordinary rice. Speaking of rice, Bufong returned to the house and opened the rice jar. The rice inside was almost empty. There's no rice again. This little guy's appetite is really big. Bufong shook his head. He cleaned up the bowls and chopsticks on the table. He returned to the house and went to sleep. Now, apart from eating, Bufong's biggest hobby was sleeping. The next day, Bufong left the house in a straw raincoat and a bamboo hat. He did not bring Xiao Bai with him. Alone, he came to a pond in the mountains. He sat quietly for the whole morning. In the basket, there were a few fat fish jumping around. Carrying the basket, Bufong walked down the mountain freely and freely. Soon, he came to the village at the foot of the mountain. This village was considered remote. When Bufong arrived, many people greeted him. After a few years, Bufong had become familiar with the villagers. The villagers also knew that there was a strange man on the mountain. At first, the villagers thought that Bufong was an immortal. However, when Bufong came down the mountain with a few fat fish to exchange for rice, the villagers knew that Bufong was just like them, a mortal who ate only 5 grains. After a while, they became familiar with each other. "Andy Zhang, do you have any rice?" I can exchange some fish that have just come out of the water with you. Bufong said to the farmer woman who was carrying a hoe in the distance. The farmer woman looked at the fish in Bufong's bamboo basket and swallowed her saliva. She also wanted to exchange. It was not easy to eat fish in the mountains. However, Brother Boo, we can't. The soldiers entered the village today. The village chief gathered a lot of rice and gave it to the soldiers. Auntie Zhang said with some regret, "If you want rice, I will go to the city to bring it for you." Bufong was stunned. There was no rice. "Auntie Zhang, you go ahead. I will continue to ask." Bufong did not care. He could always exchange for rice. Even if he could not, he was not in a hurry. He had to be calm. In the distance, there was the sound of stir-frying, and there was a fragrance. Bufong raised his eyebrows slightly. "The soldiers eat over there. Brother Boo, if you are really hungry, go to the village and ask the village chief to make room for you." Auntie Zhang said, "My son is going to the city to be an official with the soldiers. Brother Boo, do you want to go?" People in the countryside were really good at chatting. Bufong replied a few words. He walked to a place in the distance. Suddenly, Bufong was stunned. In the big, open space in the village, there were tables full of banquets. The officials were drinking and chatting. Bufong carried the bamboo basket and frowned slightly. His gaze passed through the many officials who were eating with grease dripping from their mouths and looked into the distance. There a figure with his head shrouded in mist stood there, although he could not see his face clearly. But Bufong could see that the other party was smiling at him. Bird Master. Chapter 1810. Lord Bird. Bufong was a little surprised. Lord Bird, a man he remembered from a long time ago, had appeared in front of him at this time. In the distance, the soldiers ate until their mouths were covered with grease. They toasted each other, and the aroma of food and the taste of the dishes spread. However, all of this seemed to have turned into nothingness. Only Bufong and Lord Bird were left. Even though Lord Bird's head was shrouded in fog, and he could not see through it, Bufong could feel the man's gaze on him. He was looking at him. Bufong was very calm. He nodded at Lord Bird. The soldiers around him did not seem to notice Lord Bird, who walked straight toward Bufong. He stopped in front of Bufong. "I can't believe you're hiding here." Lord Bird smiled faintly. Bufong still remembered how he and Lord Bird had tasted wine and food together in the ancient heaven god's relic. This man seemed to have his own unique views on food. He was extraordinary. However, Bufong could not figure out who Lord Bird was. He could not figure out when his cultivation base was still there, and now he had lost it. Bufong had no way of figuring it out. Soul God, the top demon who suppressed the universe, is hiding here. "You're very carefree, aren't you?" Lord Bird walked over. His aura was very ordinary, just like the other villagers in the village. Except, of course, for the fog that hung over his head. Bufong gave Lord Bird a strange look. Of course, Bufong did not think that Lord Bird had also lost his cultivation base. This man had been very mysterious from the moment he appeared. Bufong had thought that this guy was Mu Hongzi, but the latter was now accompanying Summer and wandering the universe. He should not have the time to look for him. Therefore, Bufong still could not see through Lord Bird. "Don't think about it. I'm the only one who knows you're here," Lord Bird said indifferently. "Do what you have to do." Lord Bird said. Bufong paused, but he did not pay attention to him. So what if Lord Bird found him? At most, he could suppress Soul God for 1,000 years. After that, given Bufong's mortal body, he might have already decayed. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Even if Lord Bird asked him to deal with Soul God, it would be impossible. Bufong ignored Bird Grandpa and went to find the village chief to exchange for some rice. However, he was rejected by the old village chief, which was a rare occurrence. The village chief sighed and said that there was no rice left in the village. The soldiers had been stationed in the village for several days and had eaten for several days. The rice stored in the village had been used up. The old village chief said that there was a war in the world outside the mountains and many people died. There was not enough food. Bufong nodded. If he couldn't get it, then he wouldn't trade. Bufong curled his lips as he glanced at the group of soldiers eating heartily in the distance. Carrying the bamboo basket, he turned around and left. Bufang hummed a song. Carefree and at ease, the current hymn was completely different from before. It was a feeling of being released from layers of shackles. In the past, he had been too tense, trying hard to rush to a higher realm and keep working toward the goal of becoming the god of cooking. He was practicing cooking all the time or thinking about how to improve his cultivation base. Or he was constantly on the road to complete the system's tasks. Now that he had calmed down, he found that the feeling of being able to do everything according to his heart was really good. If he couldn't get rice, then he wouldn't trade. Bufang carried the basket and walked up the mountain again. He hummed a song. Although it was out of tune, he was happy to do it. Lord Bird followed him quietly, not too fast or too slow. Bufang returned to the house on the mountain. Xiaobai was still sitting at the door, its mechanical eyes extremely dark. 80 was running in the yard, chasing a bug. It seemed to hear Bufang's footsteps coming back. 80 raised its head, shook its chicken butt, and ran toward Bufang. When it got close to Bufang, its chicken claws slapped the ground, and a wave of air swirled. It flapped its wings and flew toward Bufang. However, when it got close to Bufang, Bufang grabbed the back of its neck and lifted it up. "Don't mess around. We have a guest today," Bufang said lightly. 80 was stunned. If there was a guest, there would be a guest. Why'd you have to emphasize it? Did you want to kill 80 to entertain the guest? 80's feathers instantly stood on end, and it kept flapping its wings, flying away from Bufang. 80 would never forget what Bufang had done to its chicken wings. Looking at 80 flying away, the corner of Bufang's mouth twitched. This little guy must be imagining things. "My humble house is simple and crude. Please make yourself at home," Bufang said to Lord Bird behind him. Lord Bird laughed loudly. "Are you living in seclusion?" With his hands behind his back, Lord Bird wandered around Bufang's simple house for a while. Then he walked out of the yard and looked at Bufang, who was busy in the yard. Bufang took out the fat fish that had not been changed into rice, put it on the chopping board, removed the scales, and cut open its belly. "Are you going to stay here for the rest of your life? You know, although you have lost your cultivation, your foundation is still there. If you continue to cultivate, although you can't reach your previous height, you won't be so weak," Lord Bird said. "Too weak to even trust a chicken? Don't talk nonsense." Bufang twitched the corner of his mouth. He raised his hand and waved at 80. 80 jumped up, and Bufang held its head. After swinging it in front of Lord Bird, he let go and let 80 play by itself. The corner of Lord Bird's mouth seemed to twitch. He didn't say anything. He just watched quietly as Bufang cooked. Without his cultivation base and divine power, Bufang could only cook ordinary ingredients without any spiritual energy. This fat fish grew in the pond on the mountain. It was not a heavenly treasure. Gurgle. The water in the wok began to boil. The god of cooking said accompanied Bufang's divine sense to suppress Soul God. Now, Bufang could be said to be all alone. With ordinary kitchen utensils and ingredients, he did not look like a top divine chef who was only one step away from becoming the god of cooking. He put some ingredients into the boiling water, and the color of the wok immediately turned slightly cloudy. Then he put the processed fish into the wok. He covered the lid and waited quietly. Bufang had caught 3 fish, so he made 3 fish dishes. One was fish stew, the other was braised fish, the other was grilled fish. Each of the 3 dishes had its own characteristics. When Bufang carried the 3 dishes and placed them on the bamboo table, Bufang's eyes lit up. Lord Bird sat down as if he was very familiar with them. There were no extra chairs. Lord Bird did not care. With a wave of his hand, his divine power condensed into a chair, and he sat down leisurely. "It smells good," Lord Bird said. "It's been a long time since I've eaten such mortal dishes." Bufang glanced at Lord Bird. He scooped up a bowl of white rice and handed it to him. It was steamed with the remaining rice. Lord Bird held a pair of chopsticks in one hand and a bowl of rice in the other. "Please, my humble abode is simple and crude. This is all I have. Please forgive me for not being a good host," Bufang said. Lord Bird chuckled. The two of them stopped talking. Holding the chopsticks, Lord Bird looked at the 3 dishes and the white rice in his hand and couldn't help but sigh. Bufong scooped up a bowl of fish soup. It was clear and transparent, exuding a faint, sweet fragrance. A few wolfberries floated on top of it, looking very simple and elegant. Gulp! A mouthful of fish soup entered his stomach. His body seemed to warm up. Heat surged through his body, and hunger came from his stomach. Bufong ate a mouthful of rice, drank a mouthful of soup, and ate a mouthful of fish. The meat of the braised fish was soft and tender. The sauce seeped into the fish, making the taste even more delicious. The control of the fire was very good. At least, the aroma of the fish made Lord Bird sigh with emotion. Lord Bird ate. He couldn't help but feel a little nervous. Had Bufong's cooking skills regressed? To be honest, they had regressed. They were not as good as Bufong at his peak. In fact, they were far from it. But that was because of the ingredients and equipment. If he had to say it, Lord Bird even felt that Bufong's cooking skills had made a small breakthrough. It was a breakthrough in mentality. Those who experience great ups and downs basically can't keep calm. You're a little amazing. Lord Bird chuckled. Do you still want to eat? Ignoring Lord Bird's words, Bufong raised his head and looked at him. Lord Bird was stunned. The corner of his mouth twitched as he watched Bufong sweep through the dishes like a tornado. Leave some for me. After a full meal, only a mess of fish bones was left on the table. Bufong leaned back in the bamboo chair, making a creaking sound. Lord Bird rubbed his belly and exhaled. Although it was a very ordinary dish, when he ate it, his appetite was greatly stimulated and he felt comfortable. How did you find this place? Bufong asked. Intuition. Lord Bird was very lazy. Bufong snorted. The universe is boundless. How could you find a planet with life, and I happen to be on it? Lord Bird shook his head with a smile and did not answer Bufong. Since Lord Bird did not say anything, Bufong did not know what to say. He was not good at talking. Do you want to cultivate? I can teach you a cultivation technique. 1,000 years should be enough for you to recover some of your cultivation base. Is that useful? If Soul God comes out 1,000 years later, I won't be able to do anything. Bufong shook his head. Without the God of Cooking's will, Bufong could not do it alone. So, what was the difference between recovering his cultivation base and not recovering his cultivation base? All he wanted was to live a little longer. However, Bufong did not want that. He wanted to live a happy life. He had been very happy in the mountain village all these years. Lord Bird fell silent. If you don't cultivate, you will die in 200 years at most. Aren't you afraid? Lord Bird asked. No matter how long I live, what's the use if I'm not happy? Bufong said faintly. It was getting late. He stood up and looked at the sky. He shook his head. It's late. It's time to sleep. Bufong's words were in order for them to leave. Lord Bird froze, then stood up and said nothing. He seemed to understand the path Bufong was pursuing. He smiled faintly. Interesting. Owner Boo, the world is big. Go out and have a look. I'll wait for the day Owner Boo returns. At that time, you and I will drink together. Ah, Lord Bird laughed out loud. He turned around and disappeared into the deep mountain night. His laughter startled the birds in the mountains. Bufong looked at Lord Bird's disappearing figure and fell silent for a while. The world is big. Go out and have a look. The corners of Bufong's mouth curled up slightly. Maybe it's time to go out and have a look. My life is limited. I should find something to do. Chapter 1811. Lord Bird left and disappeared. Bufong's life returned to normal. He worked at sunrise and rested at sunset. He cooked natural delicacies and enjoyed the delicacies brought by nature. It was simple and unpretentious. Xiao Bai's mechanical eyes dimmed, and it seemed to have become clumsier. Xiao Bai would occasionally climb onto Xiao Bai's head and turn its nimble chicken head, clucking a few times. Occasionally, it would shake its chicken butt and run into the fields, chasing after bugs. The originally extraordinary Octatic Treasure's chicken had become like a wild pheasant on the mountain. Bufong was very satisfied, or rather, he enjoyed this kind of salted, fish-like life. When he was bored, he would study all kinds of delicacies. Studying delicacies became his only pleasure during this period of time. Outside the mountain, it was a chaotic world. All kinds of wars broke out continuously, and the tragic killings caused the flames of war to spread all over the place. There was no sun or moon in the mountain. Spring, summer, autumn, and winter changed continuously. He hadn't left the mountain for a long time and didn't go to the village to exchange for rice. White snow fluttered down from the sky and landed on the ground in front of the wooden house, covering the ground with a thick layer of cotton-padded jacket. Xiaobai sat in the courtyard and stared blankly, as if it had been made into a snowman by the white snow. Xiaobai had a handful of snow on its head as it ran on the snowy ground. Bu Fong wore a thick cotton-padded jacket and exhaled a mouthful of white air. Gurgle, gurgle. The flames rose slightly, and the hot water in the pot emitted steam. Bu Fong took a teacup and sprinkled a few strands of blackened tea leaves. This tea was a specialty of the mountain. It was produced in very small quantities and was discovered by Bu Fong by chance. He poured the boiling water into the teacup. The tea leaves were soaked, and the fragrance of the tea spread out, lingering in the air. The tea leaves swirled in the cup. The color of the tea gradually turned from transparent to dark green. It looked very comfortable. Bu Fong held the cup with both hands and sat on the chair with a cotton-padded jacket draped over his shoulders. He looked at the pure, white snow outside. Days passed. Bu Fong didn't know how long he had been in the mountain. Chi. He drank a mouthful of tea, and the warmth dispersed the coldness in his body. He sat on the chair for a long time. Only then did Bu Fong return to his house. He took a hoe and went up the mountain. Although there were fewer ingredients on the mountain during winter, he didn't care. Finding the ingredients was fate. Xiaobai followed them quietly. The man and the puppet climbed up the mountain. On this snowy day, the mountain was covered with pure white snow. It was indeed difficult to find delicious ingredients in the vast expanse of whiteness. In the distance, a snow rabbit was hopping around. Bu Fong saw it, but did not move. He carried the hoe and quietly followed the snow rabbit. The snow rabbit jumped all the way. Very quickly, he burrowed into the nest. There were a few bunnies clustered around him, and their cute little heads were spinning around. Bu Fong smiled. He took a look from afar, picked up his hoe, and walked on the snow. On the snowy mountain, there were many other ingredients besides the snow rabbit. Winter mushrooms were one of them. The small mushroom clung to the tree trunk, and the white snow fell down like a flower blooming in the white light. Bu Fong was happily picking the mushrooms. He put them into the basket. Every winter, he would come here to pick the mushrooms. At this time, the mushrooms were the most beautiful. After Bu Fong picked them, he would dry them in the sun and spread them out for later use. Of course, the mushrooms were also very delicious when cooked. He picked the mushrooms. Bu Fong did not leave directly. He walked on the mountain. Soon, a hungry wild wolf stared at Bu Fong. Then, he leaped toward Bu Fong. The wild wolf was hungry. Bu Fong was also hungry. Xiaobai was clumsy. But after one slap, the wild wolf could not get up. Bu Fong happily tied the wild wolf and threw it into the basket. Because the basket was much heavier, he let Xiaobai carry it. Although the harvest was good, Bu Fong did not plan to go back. He came to the pond in the mountain. The pond was wrapped in a thick layer of ice. Fish were the fattest in winter. Of course, Bu Fong would not let go of such delicious food. He made a hole in the ice, and, after a while, a few plump fish fell into the basket. Satisfied, Bu Fong left the pond. He hummed a song as he left the mountain amidst the pure white snow. It had to be said that Bu Fong had hummed songs for so many years, but he still did not improve. He returned to the house. The day in winter was always very short. It was getting dark soon, and the temperature was getting colder. Bu Fong made a fire and cleaned the fish. The fat fish was patted by Bu Fong. From a room, he took out the dried mushrooms, which he had prepared in the past years. The dried mushrooms had a unique fragrance. Xiao Chun took the mushrooms and placed them on top of the fish that had been processed. They were put into the pot to steam. Hot air rose up in the mountain. Clatter! The white snow was crushed. The sharp light kept bursting out. White snow fell rapidly from the tree trunks. The terrifying saber-chi rampaged through the forest, and countless trees were chopped into pieces. The sound of heavy, panting rang out. A figure in blood-stained armor had a big gash on his shoulder, starting from his back and extending to his waist. Hot blood kept spilling from it. It sprinkled on the pure white snow, causing the snow to melt. His hair was disheveled, and his face was pale. The man was struggling to climb in the snow. From time to time, he would look back. His pursuers were chasing him. Swoosh! The arrowheads emitted a cold light, like deadly arrows in the dark night. They chased after the badly injured man who was climbing quickly. Puff! Puff! Arrows fell to the ground one after another. The snow flew. The man's pupils suddenly shrank. His body rolled up, and a great force rushed out of the snow. His body spun. An arrow whizzed past, brushing past his face. Duga Wuxuang, you can't escape. You're the top of the 10 great swordsmen of the empire. Running away like a stray dog is a disgrace to your name. A faint voice rang out. Then, in the dense forest behind the man, the assassins in black walked on the snow. Their bodies were bursting with true energy. They moved extremely fast. The badly injured man spat out a mouthful of blood. With a cold snort, he continued to climb forward. He swung the sword in his hand. A sharp sword chi suddenly exploded, slashing towards those assassins in the distance. At this moment, several of them reached out at the same time. One sword after another fell into their hands. They raised their swords. Puff! The swords tore through the snowflakes. They collided with the incoming sword energy. The swords bent and bounced off with a great force. This caused the assassins to retreat a few steps. Their swords left no trace. The cultivation base of these assassins was quite high. After all, the man was seriously injured. The more he activated it, the weaker his aura became. The assassins approached. They fought him in the mountains. The battle was earth-shattering. The ground was covered with blood, and countless trees were cut into nothingness by the sword energy. The whole mountain seemed to be shaking. The swords collided with each other, clanging sounds echoing. After a long time, the battle was over. Only the unrecognizable corpses of the assassins were left on the ground. Footprints of different depths gradually spread toward the depths of the dense forest. The wind and snow blew. The footprints were drowned under the white snow. Gulp! Gulp! Bufang checked the time and turned off the stove. He opened the steamer. Suddenly, rolling hot air surged out of the steamer. The hot air was like a rolling ball of energy in the dark night, gradually dissipating. It smells good. Bufang sniffed the fragrance in the air. The fragrance of dried mushrooms mixed with the fragrance of fish. The tender fish wrapped under the smooth fish skin looked very delicious. In addition to this steamed fish, Bufang also stir-fried mushroom slices. The slightly sticky sauce fell, and the mushroom slices seemed to shine. Fresh mushrooms and dried mushrooms had a completely different taste. Bufang placed the dish on the table. He turned and returned to the wooden hut. He took a jar of wine from the cellar. This was the wine brewed by Bufang. He had been brewing it for several years. He would only take a sip when he was satisfied. The delicious taste of the wine intoxicated Bufang. He had brewed a lot of wine, so it could be said that Bufang had a deep understanding of good wine. However, in Bufang's opinion, wine brewing in the past was made with a unique brewing method. In fact, wine brewing needed to be paved with emotion. The intensity of the emotion depended on the brewer. In the past, Bufang's feelings for wine brewing were more superficial. Of course, even if it was just a technique, it was still very amazing. The jar of wine was not big. It was about the size of a fist. Bufang happily slapped the lid open. A strong aroma of wine spread from it. Wuxuang was very tired. He felt that he had lost too much blood. He almost fainted. The path to immortality, the singing, he Wuxuang, was also on the verge of death. Sighing helplessly, he felt very helpless. Could it be that the sword god of this generation was going to die in this remote and uninhabited mountain? Wuxuang smiled bitterly. Perhaps many years later, people would name this mountain Mount Wuxuang. After all, he, the sword god, was lying on this mountain. In the distance, a little flame rose. It flowed slowly. The flame gradually spread in his eyes, and he felt a little dizzy. Wushuang coughed up a mouthful of blood. Drops of blood fell on his snow-white face and dyed it the color of plum blossoms. Plop! He fell to his knees. His whole face was buried in the snow. His messy hair spread over his face, and he could only hear his own breathing and the beating of his heart. I'm going to die, Wushuang sighed. Suddenly, a fat chicken flapped its wings and walked over on the snow. The chicken seemed to observe him curiously for a while. It circled around his body. Wushuang could not move at all, but he could sense the lively, fat chicken in front of him. Suddenly, the fat chicken stepped on his head with its claw and started jumping around his body. Wushuang was so angry that he almost died. He rolled his eyes. He finally could not stand it anymore. Little 8, stop it. A thin figure walked out of the flame. A faint voice rang out. Wushuang's consciousness was blurred. In the end, he only felt a cold iron palm fall on him and pick him up like a chicken. With his strong consciousness, Wushuang opened his eyes. In an instant, a lump of iron with an overturned iron skin appeared in his eyes. Wushuang was taken aback and fainted. Xiao Bai, you scared me. The corner of Bu Fang's mouth twitched. I can't believe someone came to this mountain in the middle of the night. Glancing at the wounded man, Bu Fang did not leave him to die. He asked Xiao Bai to bring the man back to the hut. He threw him in the yard. Bu Fang sat on a chair, rubbed his hands, and exhaled a puff of white smoke. He was ready to eat. Fish steamed with mushrooms was absolutely delicious. Bu Fang picked up the fish with his chopsticks. It was soft and fragrant. In an instant, it melted in his mouth like juice, a mouthful of fish and a mouthful of wine. When the cool wine entered his stomach, it was like a ball of fire, making all the pores on Bu Fang's body open. Little 8 wandered around Bu Fang, begging for food. Bu Fang threw a piece of fish to Little 8. Then, he poured a glass of wine. She walked to the side of the heavily injured man. Looking at the latter's miserable appearance, he sighed. He poured the wine into the man's mouth. Chapter 1812. The snow rustled down. What followed was silence. It was as if the dust of history had been sealed. Wushuang woke up. His ears were extremely quiet, so quiet that he thought he might be in hell. He moved, and his body made a noise as he touched the firewood. Oh, I can move. Wushuang was stunned. He looked at his body. On his body, the wound that had originally covered his shoulder all the way to his waist had completely healed. The fatal wound has healed overnight. Wushuang's breath caught in his throat. He looked around and found himself in the woodshed. Which experts saved me? I'm afraid only an immortal has the power to save this kind of injury, right? He stood up. His blood and energy were a little unstable, but he did not care. He picked up the sword he had thrown on the ground. It was his lifeblood and his pride as a sword god. Stroking the sword, Wushuang exhaled and said, "Since the damned heaven doesn't want to take my life, I'll cut it down with my sword." He pushed open the shabby door of the woodshed. Wushuang walked through the door. The ground was covered with soft snow. In the yard, a fat chicken was flapping its wings happily. It was the chicken that had stepped on his head before he passed out yesterday. Wushuang narrowed his eyes. You're awake? If you're awake, pack up and leave. An indifferent voice resounded. Wushuang paused. He turned his head and saw a thin young man sitting on a chair with a bowl of hot fish soup in his hand, gulping it down. Beside him, a lump of iron with its iron skin flying around quietly stood there. Where am I? Wushuang frowned. He could see that there was no fluctuation of true energy in the thin young man. There was no doubt that the young man was a mortal, not a cultivator. The same went for the puppet. There was no fluctuation of true energy, so it was probably a mortal as well. Perhaps this young man is the disciple of the senior who saved me? Is the immortal master at home? I'll never forget your kindness. Wushuang nodded slightly at Bu Fang. However, Bu Fang just glanced at him indifferently and did not say anything. He drank a mouthful of fish soup and exhaled a mouthful of hot air. The atmosphere was silent for a moment. "I'm Dugu Wushuang, the sword god of the empire." Wushuang frowned and said in a more serious tone, "There's no such thing as an immortal master. Now that you've recovered, you should leave. It's fate that you were able to find this place in the vast wilderness." Bufang took a bite of fish and said. He stood up and walked towards the wooden hut. Wushuang took a deep breath. This mortal, what arrogance! However, Wushuang did not cause any trouble. Instead, he gave Bufang a deep look. He walked to the wooden hut and sat down quietly. "Since you don't want to tell me, then I will wait here for Master Immortal's return," Wushuang said. His heart was burning. Searching for immortals, searching for immortals. The path to immortality was hard to find, and everyone in the world was captivated by it. Since he was fated to meet the immortal master, how could he leave so easily? Xiaobai turned its mechanical head and glanced at Wushuang with its dull mechanical eyes. 80 cackled with a teasing look in its eyes. Inside the wooden hut, Bufang came out in a thick cotton-padded jacket. "Why are you still here?" He frowned when he saw Wushuang sitting in a chair. "I'm here to see Master Immortal," Wushuang said. "I told you there's no immortal master. You'd better leave now, or I'll kick you out," Bufang said. He had saved Wushuang because it was fate that the latter would find his wooden hut in the vast wilderness. It was just a matter of a cup of wine. Bufang did not want to leave anyone in the wooden hut. Wushuang was displeased. "You're so unreasonable, young man. I'm here to see Master Immortal. If he comes back and refuses to see me, it's fine, but why are you kicking me out?" Wushuang said. How could he give up the chance to become an immortal? Although Wushuang's swordsmanship was extraordinary, he was still far from being a legendary immortal. He had tried to break through the void with his martial arts, but he failed. From then on, he knew he was still far from becoming an immortal. "I'm unreasonable? If I weren't, you would have turned into a pile of bones and fed to the wolves in the mountains." Bufang shook his head, the corner of his mouth curling up. He found it funny. "Itty, kick him out," Bufang said lightly. After that, he turned into the wooden hut, picked up the basket, and was about to go out for a trip. "Kick me out." The corner of Wushuang's mouth twitched. Bufang was just a mortal. There's only a wooden puppet and a chicken here. Who's going to kick him out? Wushuang did not mind. Bufang, on the other hand, went straight out with the basket on his back. Cluck, cluck, cluck. All of a sudden, Wushuang froze. In the distance, the fat chicken's eyes suddenly became very sharp. It lowered its head slightly. Then it slapped its wings hard on its body. Taking big strides, it began to gallop at full speed. It ran faster and faster. Cluck! A chicken crow rang out. 80's claws stepped on the snow. The snowy ground instantly exploded, revealing a large chicken claw. Then, 80 leaped into the air, spread its claws, and kicked Wushuang in the face. What the F***? Wushuang was dumbfounded. He had no time to react. A fat chicken kicked him in the face, and his body flew backward uncontrollably. He was thrown out of the wooden hut. Bam! Snow swirled in the air. Wushuang stared blankly at the sky. He was kicked out of the hut by a king chicken. He was so sad that he wanted to cry. Bufang walked out of the hut with the basket on his back and a bamboo stick in his hand. Xiaobai followed him. He glanced at Wushuang, who was lying in the snow and doubting his life. Expressionlessly, he continued to walk. Not long after, his figure disappeared in the mountain road that was shrouded in clouds and mist. Wushuang rolled over and got to his feet. He glanced at Bufang, who had disappeared into the distance. Now his heart was pounding. He was wrong. He had been wrong all along. His first impression was that an immortal should be an old man. Little did he know that this Bufang, who had no aura of true energy, was an immortal. He could not believe that such a powerful fat chicken would obey Bufang's words. This showed that Bufang was definitely extraordinary. Wushuang rose to his feet. However, before he could stand up straight, 80 ran up, jumped up, spread its claws, and kicked him in the face. Wushuang was dumbfounded. He was kicked away again. Snow fell all over the ground. Wu Shuang was furious. He was the #1 sword god of the empire, and yet he was kicked by a chicken? Even if he died in battle, he would never be defeated by a chicken. Cluck! Snow swirled in the air. Wu Shuang fell to the snow again. Bu Fong went deep in the mountain this time and did not come back for a while. He went to the top of the mountain and spent the night there. Finally, he dug up a huge rock with a hoe. He dug out a jar of wine. After 3 years of brewing, it's finally a success. The corner of Bu Fong's mouth twitched. Buried at the top of the mountain, the wine had been baptized by the essence of heaven and earth. It was definitely extraordinary. He lifted a small corner of the lid. A strong aroma of wine poured out of it. Taking a deep breath, Bu Fong was intoxicated. At this moment, at the foot of the mountain, clouds rolled, and a magnificent sea of clouds emerged. It seemed that purple smoke was coming from the east and converging into the jar of wine. The jar of wine exuded a majestic aura. Bu Fong's eyes narrowed. Even with the most ordinary ingredients, he could make a world-shaking wine. He sat cross-legged at the top of the mountain. Snow swirled in the air. It fell with a rustle. Bu Fong poured a glass of wine. The wine was blue as the sky. Bu Fong took a sip. The rich aroma of wine immediately rushed into his limbs and bones. Bu Fong felt a throb. This sip of wine contained the essence of his many years of accumulation. It might not contain any emotion, but inexplicably, it made his eyes bright. He took a sip of wine and watched the surging sea of clouds. Bu Fong's heart was as calm as still water. How should he walk the path of the god of cooking? Should he cut off his 7 emotions and 6 desires like Soul God? Should he walk the ruthless path? But could heartless delicacies really reach the peak? Or, like what Bu Fong had thought before, gathering the best delicacies in the world, he could cook the most delicious dishes and become the god of cooking? Maybe both were wrong. The real god of cooking wasn't like what he had imagined. Bu Fong drank in silence. He watched the clouds roll and move. The next day, Bu Fong went down the mountain. The clouds were so deep that no one knew where he was. However, Bu Fong's bamboo stick gently tapped and found the way back. He returned to the wooden hut. Bu Fong was bewildered. In the distance, a figure was kneeling in the snow. The pure white snow had already covered his body, as if wrapping him up into a snowman. 80 held a chicken wing and stroked its chicken leg, walking back and forth in a leisurely manner. It seemed to sense Bu Fong's return. 80 took a step forward and swooped toward Bu Fong at full speed. With a cluck, it leaped to its feet. Bu Fong raised his hand and caught it by the neck. "Why haven't you left yet?" Bu Fong threw 80 onto Xiao Bai's head and looked at Wu Shuang, who was kneeling on the ground. Wu Shuang stared at 80 with a resentful look on his face. His face was covered with chicken claw marks. "Senior, I was wrong." Wu Shuang knelt on the ground and said to Bu Fong, "You can leave now." Bu Fong shook his head and said indifferently. He strode forward and stepped into the wooden hut, washing vegetables and cooking. A series of movements were as smooth as flowing water. Soon, a rich aroma wafted out and spread between heaven and earth. Wu Shuang sniffed the aroma. A strong sense of hunger came from his stomach. How could it smell so good? Wasn't it just a simple dish of stir-fried delicacies? As the #1 sword god in the capital, he had tasted all kinds of delicacies, but he had never smelled such a delicious aroma. Bu Fong ignored him. After he finished cooking, he began to drink and eat. As he ate, Bu Fong could not help but frown. He sighed. He put down his wine glass. "It's been a long time since I've had delicious rice. I miss it," Bu Fong muttered. He finished the meal in a relaxed manner. Then he cleared the dishes. He put on his bamboo hat and carried the basket, which was filled with swimming, fat fish. It was time to go down the mountain and exchange some rice with the villagers. He saw that Bu Fong was about to go out again. Wu Shuang's face darkened. This immortal master, can he bear to see me kneel here all the time? Yes, he really can't bear to see me kneel here. 80 swung its drumstick in front of him. Wu Shuang felt sad. Bu Fong grabbed his bamboo stick and walked down the mountain. Wu Shuang's eyes lit up. Immortal master is going down the mountain? With this thought in mind, Wu Shuang did not kneel again. Climbing to his feet, He patted his numb knees and swiftly followed behind Zhang Xian with his sword in hand. He followed Bufang from a distance, not daring to disturb Bufang. Bufang went down the mountain and walked toward the village according to his memory. After so many years, he wondered if the villagers still remembered him, although Bufang had lost his cultivation. However, he knew that Wu Shuang was following him. He didn't care. If she wanted to follow, then let her. He walked along the muddy road. The shadow of the village was right in front of him. When Wu Shuang saw the direction in which Bufang was heading, a strange expression appeared on his face. He wanted to say something but hesitated, but after thinking about it, he did not continue. Bufang came to the village. An ice-cold chill surged over. This made Bufang frown. The village was in a mess and dilapidated. The farm tools were covered in pure white snow, and some of the houses had collapsed. It was extremely dilapidated. The whole village was deserted. It looked like a deserted village. Immortal Master, I don't know what kind of entanglement you have with this village, but it was slaughtered 3 years ago. 300 people were killed, Wu Shuang sighed. Chapter 1813. Of the 300 people in the village, not a single one will be spared. Wu Shuang's voice was heavy when he said this. In troubled times, human lives were as worthless as grass. He looked at the deserted village covered in snow. It might have once been inhabited, but now it was in ruins. In troubled times, everyone was seeking survival, and the most miserable ones were these mortals. Wu Shuang fell silent. It was not that he didn't want to speak, but he couldn't. A fear born in the depths of his soul made it difficult for him to even breathe. A clang rang out. The sword fell to the ground. Wu Shuang fell to the ground, his eyes wide as he stared at Bufang in horror. At this moment, this mortal seemed to be as terrifying as a heavenly god. Immortal Master. Wu Shuang opened his mouth and struggled to make sound. It was as if a hand had grabbed his throat. Suddenly, the terrible aura disappeared. He relaxed. Although it was a snowy day, his whole body was soaked with cold sweat, and beads of sweat rolled down his forehead. This time, when he looked at Bufang, he did not doubt him at all. Bufang sighed. He felt lost. Looking at the white, deserted village, his emotions were somewhat complicated. At that moment, he accidentally revealed his state of mind, which terrified Wu Shuang. After all, Bufang was once in existence who had reached the peak of the universe. A chaotic saint was supreme no matter where he was. Even though Bufang had lost all his strength, just a state of mind and a wisp of his will were enough to make people feel terrible pressure. This was the saying that a starving camel was still bigger than a horse. Snowflakes danced in the air. Time and space seemed to have become very quiet. Wu Shuang sat on the ground, gasping for breath. It seemed that only the sound of his breathing could be heard. Suddenly, he let out a sigh, which made him feel extremely shocked. Go and find a pheasant. Bufang's faint voice rang out. Wu Shuang immediately felt relieved, as if he had been pardoned. He answered and scrambled towards the wilderness in the distance. Bufang sat cross-legged on the ground and looked at the barren village with a complicated gaze. The voices and smiles of the villagers were still floating in front of him. The simple villagers left a deep impression on Bufang. Big aunt, big uncle, old village chief, one figure after another seemed to float past his face. Bufang exhaled. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Perhaps this was the fate of mortals. Soon, Wu Shuang returned. He was carrying a pheasant in his hand. He handed the pheasant to Bufang, his face full of respect and apprehension. Before, he had only guessed that Bufang was an immortal master. But in that instant just now, he felt as if he had fallen into death with just a thought. Bufang must be an immortal master. Moreover, he was a super powerful immortal master. Searching for immortals. Wasn't he searching for immortals? Bufang took the pheasant. Under Wu Shuang's astonished gaze, he began to process it. Bufang dug out a black wok that was covered in dust from the barren village. After cleaning it up, he set up a wok in the village. Flames rose, dispelling much of the cold in the surroundings. Wushuang did not know what Bufang was going to do. Bufang asked him to find another chicken monkey, so he sat quietly in the distance, waiting for Bufang's orders. However, Bufang did not give him any orders. Instead, he went about his own business. The pheasant was processed, its feathers were plucked, and its flesh was gradually hardened after being boiled in hot water. Bufang's movements did not slow down. He was still processing the ingredients. Not only the pheasant, but also the fat fish Bufang had prepared, removing scales, cutting open the abdomen, and removing the internal organs. Bufang's movements were as smooth as flowing water. At this moment, Bufang was like a simple chef cooking seriously. Wushuang did not dare to disturb Bufang. He could only watch quietly. Bufang's movements were fast, and a fragrance filled the air. However, as he sniffed the fragrance, a hint of sorrow came into Wushuang's eyes. Shocked, he stimulated his body with his sword intent. The fragrance can affect one's mind? Wushuang was horrified, and he felt that Bufang was more and more mysterious. Soon, 2 dishes were cooked. One was a golden roast chicken, and the other was a fragrant steamed fish. With 1 dish in each hand, Bufang placed the 2 dishes in the snow. A rich fragrance spread in all directions. However, it seemed to carry an oppressive sadness. Bufang sat in front of the 2 dishes. He did not eat. He was lost in thought. He had retired to this planet and returned to the life of a mortal. But mortals would eventually return to dust. What should Bufang do in the future? Lord Bird had asked Bufang what would happen if he, Bufang, became a pile of dust in a few hundred years. Bufang's answer had been carefree. Now, looking at the barren village, a sense of loneliness suddenly spread. Death was lonely. If he died, what would happen to his old friends? You, Lord Go, Hades era, who were in seclusion, what would happen to them? If they learned of his death, they would be very sad. The annihilation of the villagers was enough to make Bufang grieve, not to mention other things. Bufang raised his hand and covered his chest. His heart ached slightly. The pain seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Soul God and the great path of the primitive universe have proven that only the ruthless path can set foot on the peak. But I'm addicted to emotions, like a fish that has lost its way. Bufang's eyes were filled with confusion. Bufang also wanted to walk the ruthless path, but he found that he could not. He could not be ruthless. Even though he had lived in seclusion in the mountains for several years, his emotions still existed. Perhaps he was a hypocritical person from the very beginning. He did not like to smile, talk, and had a poker face. But the feelings of the heart could not lie. If he were really ruthless, he would not have so many old friends by his side. The great path of the primitive universe and the soul god were all alone. They were invincible in heaven and earth, but they were lonely in the universe. Bufang was lucky. He had many people around him. Lord Go, Era, Xiaopi Yu Xiaobai, Xiao Xiaolong, Xiaoyin Yu familiar names came to mind. Bufang shook his head. His face was bitter. He stood up. The barren village was still as quiet as before. Bufang put his palms together, bowed slightly, and bid farewell to the villagers who used to be his friends. Behind Bufang, Wushuang widened his eyes. He saw spots of bright light suddenly flash in the barren village. Many figures appeared in the sky, walking and bustling about. The busy scene of the barren village that had disappeared suddenly reappeared. It was like a projection in the river of time. After a long time, everything disappeared. The barren village was still dilapidated, and the snow had swept away the dust of history. With his hands clasped behind his back, Bufang left the village. Step by step, he returned to the mountain. Wushuang took a deep breath. He was extremely shocked. Without hesitation, he turned his head and followed Bufang. The road back to the mountain was covered with snow. The 2 of them returned to the hut halfway up the mountain. It was late at night. The light in Bufang's hut went out. He had fallen asleep. Wushuang was in the woodshed, unable to calm down for a long time. He knew that his immortal fate had appeared, and he had to seize it. If he did not seize it, he would miss it forever. That night, soon it was over. Wushuang opened his eyes and heard rustling outside the door. He grabbed his sword and rushed out. In the yard, Bufong was carrying a thick bag. The fat chicken was stuffed in Bufong's chest, so only its head could be seen. Xiaobai also carried a bag, his mechanical eyes dim as he stood beside Bufong. Is he going on a long journey? Wu Shuang was shocked. He grabbed a handful of snow and wiped his face to wake himself up. Immortal Master, what are you going to do? He asked. I'm going out for a walk. Do you want to follow me? Bufong glanced at Wu Shuang. Wu Shuang was stunned. If you want to follow me, just follow me, Bufong said. After that, he pushed open the fence of the hut. Wu Shuang followed him out. Bufong locked the fence, grabbed his bamboo stick, stepped on the snow, and left quietly. Carrying a bag, Xiaobai followed Bufong step by step. 80 poked its little head out of Bufong's arms. Without hesitation, Wu Shuang grabbed his sword and followed. The three figures slowly disappeared into the snowy depths of the mountains. Planet immortality was not big, but it would take countless years to travel on foot. Bufong, Xiaobai, and Wu Shuang, who had been following them. The three of them strolled across the planet. Starting from the mountains, they set out for the rest of the world. Wu Shuang was like a personal guard, guarding Bufong and helping him with many things. Bufong did not refuse and acquiesce to his behavior. Time passed, and 10 years flew by. Bufong's face had become much more resolute, and his eyes were filled with vicissitudes of life. Wu Shuang was dressed in shabby clothes, carrying a sword that had not been drawn for 10 years, and his face was covered with an unshaven beard. Xiaobai, on the other hand, had not changed much. His iron skin was turned outward, and his mechanical eyes were still dim. 80 was still small and cute. Even when walking on foot, the little thing was still chubby. 50 years. The three of them continued walking. Wu Shuang had begun to show signs of old age. His back was stooped, and the veins on his arms were bulging. But he did not complain. He still followed Bufong and traveled the continent with Bufong. During the days he spent with Bufong, Wu Shuang had eaten delicious food and experienced an unprecedented change in his state of mind. In the past, he was called the #1 sword god of the empire. But when the empire fell, the sword god died. The so-called sword god had long since disappeared from the continent. But to be called the sword god, there were at least tens of thousands of people who had died under his sword. However, following Bufong made him feel as if he had experienced a soul baptism. Although he had not drawn his sword for decades, his understanding of the sword path had deepened a lot. The 100th year. The continent was almost at its end. They had left their traces in the polar regions of planet immortality, the endless forests, and the boundless sea. Wu Shuang's hair had turned white, and he had aged a lot. His blood and energy were beginning to dry up. The magnificent sword god of a generation was indeed old. Bufong's appearance did not change much, but in the depths of his eyes, one could see the old will. After all, his body might not deteriorate after 100 years, but his soul could not bear it. Now his soul was that of a mortal. Bufong had become more and more reserved. Xiaobai and 80's appearance had not changed. The 200th year. Wu Shuang could not walk anymore. He had once stood at the peak, but he had not found the immortal path, so he was still immortal. Bufong was also old. His hair was white, and his face was wrinkled. He was a stooped old man. They did not continue to walk the continent, because they had already visited all the places they could go. The world was big, and they had already seen it all. Therefore, Bufong did not continue to walk. In the past 200 years, they had seen the rise and fall of dynasties. When they were tired of walking, they should take a rest. In the downtown area, Bufong and Wu Shuang bought a house and lived here in seclusion. Bufong returned to his old business and opened a restaurant. However, he opened it casually. He only cooked according to his mood. Wu Shuang did odd jobs in the restaurant, and his sword had long been sealed away by him. He did not know whether Bufong was an immortal master. But would an immortal master grow old like a mortal? It was meaningless to care about this. He just wanted to live a quiet life now. He had tempered his heart in the mortal world. The current sword god had a stronger sword intent than he had in his heyday. The 300th year. Wu Shuang's life came to an end. He could not walk anymore, and he could no longer be a waiter. Bufong was also old, and he stayed quietly in the restaurant. The downtown area changed again and again, and so did the neighbors. The end of life was always calm and elegant. In the restaurant, Bufong poured a glass of wine and toasted Wu Shuang, who was sitting cross-legged across from him. The latter's breath was weak. He stared at Bufong with his cloudy eyes, full of complicated emotions. Xiaobai and 80 were both in the restaurant. The atmosphere was a little heavy. After a long time, he sighed leisurely. Immortal Master, I'll take my leave first. The corners of Wu Shuang's wrinkled mouth twitched slightly. Bufong drank the wine in his glass. Boom! A wisp of extremely sharp sword intent swept away the vanity and soared into the sky. It soared into the sky. Terrible sword energy bloomed in the sky. This was the sword intent that had been condensed for 300 years. As soon as the sword intent appeared, the world was shocked. It was as if the legendary sword god had returned to the earth. In the restaurant, after Wu Shuang unleashed the sword strike, Wu Shuang's eyes widened. He lowered his head in satisfaction. His hands fell weakly to his waist. Bufong held the glass, and the wine in it rippled. After a long time, he sighed quietly. Time passed in a flash. In the void, Lord Bird appeared with his hands clasped behind his back. Outside planet Immortality, one figure after another came over from the void. The looks in their eyes were very complicated. Their auras were extremely powerful, and they were all the top experts of the primitive universe. On this day, the top experts of the primitive universe arrived on planet Immortality one after another. The whole planet was boiling. Chapter 1814. When the vanity was gone, all that was left was loneliness. Bufong sat upright in the restaurant. It was very quiet and peaceful. The wine swirled in the cup, rippling and spreading out in circles. Wu Shuang's head was bowed, and his vitality was gone. He was a sword god and a cultivator. But on planet Immortality, those who did not become immortals would always be mortals, and their lives would come to an end one day. Now, after following Bufong for 300 years, his life had come to an end. The last wisp of wick had run out. It turned into a dazzling sword intent and bloomed in the void. Wu Shuang's thinking was simple. Even if he was going to die, he wanted to leave one last breathtaking scene in this world. And he did. His sword shook the whole planet Immortality. Countless experts exclaimed in admiration. Many peak experts of the martial way felt their hair stand on end. From this sword, they felt the invincibility and loneliness of tearing the void apart. This sword was not weaker than the sword of an immortal. However, this stunning sword strike was just the beginning. Everyone on the planet raised their heads and looked up at the starry sky. They were shocked to find, outside the starry sky, meteors fell one after another. A vast meteor shower shocked the world. Everyone thought that this was just a meteor shower, but they were wrong. The flames dissipated. What was revealed was the silhouettes of people walking in the air. Immortals. The whole planet was boiling. Everyone knelt on the ground. Countless experts of the martial way roared with desire. Planet Immortality had always been searching for immortals. However, they had not seen immortals for tens of thousands of years. But today, they saw the legendary immortals. One immortal after another descended. Countless people were excited. They kowtowed and knelt, praying to heaven. Hutta looked at the mortals below with a complicated look in her eyes. This planet was too backward. The concentration of spiritual energy here was not even 1% of that in the primitive universe. Is that man hiding here? Hutta's sighed. It had been more than 300 years since that war. That man had disappeared for more than 300 years. Although the universe had been peaceful for more than 300 years. However, under this calmness, there was a turbulent undercurrent that was even more unbearable. At that time, everyone thought that the end of the world was coming. After all, the supreme soul god, who was comparable to the primordial heavenly Tao, had descended. However, no one had expected this. The mighty soul god was suppressed and sealed by that man. He had sealed soul god at the cost of his cultivation base. Below, Countless mortals were kneeling in worship. Hutu could feel the surging spiritual consciousness. That was the faith of mortals. Hutu sighed. Why was Bufang hiding on this star? Just because this star is backward. Could it be that he wanted to quietly die of old age on this star? The mortals on this planet were constantly seeking immortality. But little did they know that a real big shot was hiding among them. To become an immortal in the mortal world. Perhaps that man was the only one who could do it. Hutu fell. Her body changed, becoming simple and unadorned. No mortals recognized her. There was a flash of light. Yang Jian appeared in plain clothes. The celestial dog followed him. Hutu and Yang Jian nodded, then turned their heads at the same time to look in the direction of the restaurant. In the restaurant, they sensed a familiar aura. It was Bufang's aura. However, this aura was extremely weak, extremely weak. It was as if it would disappear at any moment. Bufang, Hutu, and Yang Jian sighed. The celestial dog let out a low whine. The three of them stepped into the restaurant. It was very leisurely, and there was a calming aura in it. Mortal herbs were planted in the restaurant, and a faint fragrance wafted in the air. Xiao Bai's dull mechanical eyes turned and rested on Hutu and Yang Jian, who had just stepped into the restaurant. Then, it stopped paying attention to them. 80 lay weakly on the ground. When it saw the others step into the restaurant, it turned its head slightly. The little fellow's mood was very depressed. Outside the door, more and more immortals and deities of the primordial universe had arrived. To them, 300 years was just a blink of an eye. The name of Bufang still resounded like thunder in their ears. The title of the god of cooking, who had suppressed Soul God, made them want to travel thousands of miles to this planet. They just wanted to see Bufang's face. Hutu saw Bufang. She sucked in a cold breath. She covered her mouth with her hand, and her eyes were filled with disbelief. Bufang's current appearance, his white hair fell over his head, and he was wrapped in a shabby robe. His face was full of wrinkles, and his paralyzed face could be vaguely seen. However, it had lost a lot of its sharpness and gained a lot of stability. How did Bufang become so old? Yang Jian's expression was complicated. 300 years was the limit for a mortal. If it weren't for Bufang's extraordinary fleshly body, he would have died when he was 200 years old. However, although Bufang had become immortal, he could not have become so old. As long as he cultivated a little, with his previous foundation, it would not be a problem for him to become an immortal king and obtain immortality. Could it be that Bufang had given up on cultivating? When the celestial dog saw Bufang, it scurried over and licked Bufang's face. There was a flicker of emotion in its eyes. Bufang rubbed the dog's head. When he looked at it, he could not help but think of Lord Go. For Lord Go and you, perhaps 300 years was just a blink of an eye. But for Bufang, it was almost a lifetime. Different horizons led to different sensitivity to time. If he were an immortal, he would not care about 300 years. But for a mortal, 300 years was already 3 lifetimes. Hutu opened her mouth, wanting to say something. However, Bufang raised his withered hand and waved it. Say no more. Do me a favor. Bufang raised his head and looked at Hutu with his cloudy eyes. Hutu paused. Bufang pointed at Wu Shuang in the distance, who had his head bowed, and said, "This boy has been with me for 300 years. If it were 100 years ago, he would have had a chance to become an immortal by cutting the void with his sword. Unfortunately, he gave up that chance and continued to follow me. Now, I want you to help me save him." Yang Jian and Hutu's eyes rested on Wu Shuang. The look in their eyes changed slightly. Although Wu Shuang had withered and died, the sword intent he left behind was extremely terrifying. Can a mortal achieve such a terrifying sword intent? Sure enough, those who could follow Bufang were not ordinary. Hutu nodded. With Bufang's identity, this was not too much to ask for. The lives on planet immortality were also in the primitive transmigration, so Hutu could naturally save him. She raised her hand and circulated her energy. She tapped her finger lightly in the void, as if she was picking a leaf. Wu Shuang had just died. His soul had not yet dissipated. Under the guidance of Hutu's energy, it quickly condensed. Although Wu Shuang was a sword god, in their eyes, he was no different from a mortal. Yang Jian raised his hand. He flicked his finger. Suddenly, a stream of energy flowed out and fell on Wu Shuang. His old body began to recover at a speed visible to the naked eye. Soon, he returned to his youthful and vigorous state. It was as if time had been turned back 300 years. Of course, Yang Jian's method was not to turn back time, but to help him recover his qi and blood and let his body bloom with vitality again. Buzz, his soul returned to his body, and his qi and blood rumbled. Soon, Wu Shuang opened his eyes. He gasped for breath, and his forehead was covered with beads of sweat. Is he dead? No, he's not dead. He's alive again. How could he be alive again? His life force had come to an end, and he could see the river of transmigration. How could he be alive again? Wu Shuang looked at his body, which was full of vitality, and he sucked in a cold breath. Wu Shuang opened his mouth. He saw Hutu and Yang Jian. He turned his head and saw Bu Fong sitting cross-legged in the distance. Could it be that Bu Fong saved him? Did the immortal master finally make a move? Owner Bu, let's go back and cultivate again. When Soul God appears, I'll need you to suppress him. Hutu looked at Bu Fong with eager eyes. Saving Wu Shuang was just a matter of convenience. However, the most important thing was to let Bu Fong return to the primitive universe. Yang Jian did not say anything. His eyes were filled with anticipation as he looked at Bu Fong. The celestial dog stuck out its tongue and licked Bu Fong's face. Everyone was waiting patiently. In midair, Lord Bird's body was shrouded in mist. Looking at Bu Fong, he sighed. His figure disappeared into the void once again. He had witnessed Bu Fong's transformation over the past 300 years. It was a transformation in the deepest part of his soul. He had witnessed Bu Fong's cooking skills improving day by day. He had never thought that, at Bu Fong's level, his cooking skills could still improve at such a speed. Every dish he cooked contained the purest and most genuine emotion. Lord Bird was filled with emotion. Back in the ancient heaven god's relic, he had discussed cooking with Bu Fong. At that time, Bu Fong insisted that the quality of the ingredients determined the quality of the food. At that time, Lord Bird used a jar of heaven god husband and wife wine to refute Bu Fong. But he had never expected that. Hundreds of years had passed. Bu Fong had given up the path he had always insisted on and embarked on the emotional cooking path. Just like the heaven god husband and wife wine. Every dish was filled with emotion. But the emotional path was even more difficult. It was almost impossible to reach the end. Some emotions might have to be witnessed by life and death. 300 years. Lord Bird hid in the void for 300 years and had been guarding Bu Fong. Bu Fong traveled the stars and comprehended the emotional path. From the feelings he had for the village at the beginning to the feelings he had seen when he traveled the continent. He was used to seeing all kinds of emotions in the mortal world. From the perspective of a bystander, he included all the emotions on this planet. Today, Bu Fong had cast aside the vanity and dregs, and what was left was the essence. Unfortunately, the emotional path was not that simple after all. Bu Fong shook his head, picked up the cup, and drank the wine in one gulp. He turned his head to look at Wu Shuang. Now that you have become an immortal, do you want to stay or leave? The path to becoming an immortal is open to you. Bu Fong said. His eyes were calm. That calmness made Hutu and Yang Jian's hearts palpitate. Wu Shuang was still a little confused. He needed to sort out his thoughts. He has become an immortal, he thought. The surging magic power in his body made his face flush. He had followed Bu Fong for 300 years, and the sword intent he had comprehended could already shatter the void. Although his comprehension was not as profound as Bu Fong's, Bu Fong had occasionally answered his questions. His sword was not the emotionless sword, but the emotional sword that had fused with his own emotions. Immortal Master, I swear to follow you until death. Wu Shuang knelt on the ground and stared at Bu Fong with some emotion. Bu Fong nodded. He did not say anything. He asked Hutu and Yang Jian to leave. Go. I will return when I have to. If I can't, everything will have to go with the rules. The stately painting can only suppress Soul God for 1,000 years. If I can't return and force my way back, I won't be able to stop Soul God from breaking the seal. It's meaningless, Bufong said. I've repaid my debt. Now what I have to do is walk the path I should walk. Bufong's words made Yang Jian, Hutu, and the others frown. They could not guess what Bufong was thinking, but they could do nothing about Bufong's stubbornness. They left the restaurant. The other immortals and deities kept coming in to visit Bufong. They were really annoyed. Bufong asked Xiao Bai, who had been silent for a long time, to make a move. After exposing a few immortals and deities, these curious little immortals and deities finally calmed down. Wu Shuang was horrified. It turned out that the dull, iron-like Xiao Bai was so strong. The immortals stayed outside the restaurant. Time flew. Another 200 years passed in a flash. Chapter 1815. Planet immortality had become extremely popular. With the arrival of many immortals, the planet, which was so small that it was not even noticed in the primitive universe, suddenly became popular. The increase in the number of experts also sped up the pace of the planet's development. The spiritual energy of heaven and earth became denser day by day, which was influenced by the strength of many almighty experts. As immortals, it was not difficult for their auras to affect the development of a planet. Because of the increase in the number of immortals, it was impossible for immortals to cultivate on a planet lacking in spirit chi for 200 years. Therefore, they found something interesting to do to pass the time in their boredom. If they did not cultivate, a few hundred years was really a long time. Immortals established sects, schools, and all kinds of powers. Planet immortality, which was originally dominated by mortals, suddenly became dominated by immortals. Some immortals even joined the establishment and replacement of mortal dynasties out of interest. The feeling of being in charge amused many immortals. Of course, immortals who could be so bored basically did not have very high cultivation bases. For example, immortal kings, immortal emperors, and saints of the Great Path. They all walked the world like mortals. The Great Path was the simplest. Sometimes it was like this. More and more immortals gathered around Bufong's restaurant. The restaurant became very popular. However, no matter how popular it was, the management of the business followed Bufong's heart. If he closed the restaurant, even if the immortals knelt and begged him, it would be useless. Although Bufong was only immortal now, and the dishes he cooked were only ordinary dishes that did not contain any spiritual energy, the immortals all ate them with relish. Yang Jian and the celestial dog seemed to have settled down around Bufong's restaurant. Every day, after eating in Bufong's restaurant, he would take the dog for a stroll. Yang Jian and the celestial emperor seemed to have settled down around Bufong's restaurant. He and the celestial emperor resigned from the important task of guarding the celestial court and came to the restaurant. He had been living there for 200 years. Erlangshan seemed to have comprehended something after the 200 years of bustling days were swept away. In the past, he was as bright as the brightest star, about to tear heaven and earth apart. He was a genius of the celestial court, and his cultivation base was extremely high. A three-pointed, double-edged saber struck fear into the hearts of countless immortals and mortals. However, after 200 years of settling down and staying with Bufong, Yang Jian's murderous nature was restrained. Every move he made was like a mortal. The celestial hound might have forgotten that it was a divine hound. Tian Tian ate and slept, slept and ate. His body was so fat that it was as if he had been punched. It no longer had the bravery of the number one divine dog of the immortal court. However, the celestial hound was happy to do so. After all, not everyone could eat cooking god Bu's dishes every day. In the restaurant, smoke curled up from the chimney. Bufong sat quietly on the futon in the restaurant. There was a small tree planted in the restaurant. This small tree was found in a rugged land when he was traveling across the stars. It was a lifeless zone filled with jagged rocks. There were rocky mountains everywhere. The weather was hot during the day and cold at night. Even Bufong felt uncomfortable in that kind of place. However, this small tree grew with great difficulty between the two rugged rocks. Its roots climbed on the rocks, and its roots were almost dried up. It was on the verge of death. If it hadn't met Bufong, no matter how unyielding it was against fate, it wouldn't have been able to resist the mighty power of nature. At that time, Bufong was deeply moved. The greatness of life impacted him. Therefore, he took the small tree away. If he didn't, the strong sapling would be completely extinct soon. Now, this sapling was growing in Bufong's restaurant. Its branches were luxuriant, and as they swayed, there seemed to be a supreme Tao connotation. This sapling had been with Bufong for hundreds of years, and it had been permeated with Bufong's Tao. Swish! Bufong, who was sitting there, opened his eyes. He got up, his back hunched. Even if it was this physical body, after 200 years, his life force had been completely depleted. When one was old, there were many things to think about. That was what Bufong was thinking now. Sometimes, he doubted whether the path he was taking was the right one. Everyone would be afraid of death, especially this kind of slow and unending death of old age. The fear of waiting for life to come to an end was like an endless nightmare that would devour everything in a person. Bufong stood up and lowered his back. His movement made Wu Shuang, who was sitting cross-legged in the restaurant, open his eyes. Elder Bu. Wu Shuang came over and supported Bufong. Are you going to open today? But your health. Wu Shuang looked worriedly at Bufong. 80 lay on Xiao Bai's head, looking listless. Bufong waved his hand and opened his eyes slightly. It's fine. Open for business, Bufong said. After that, he walked slowly toward the kitchen. Wu Shuang sighed. He was now known as Sword Immortal Dugu. It seemed that under the influence of Bufong, his cultivation base had skyrocketed, and he was now only one step away from the Immortal King realm. His sword could cut through the heavens, and its power was terrifying. Even Yang Jian had praised his swordsmanship. In the past 200 years, Wu Shuang had only drawn his sword once. That time, it was a reckless heaven immortal who wanted Bufong to cook. Even after being rejected by Bufong, he still refused to give up. Wu Shuang did not say anything. He drew his sword. Even if he killed a heaven immortal, his sword would not be stained with blood, and the heaven immortal's soul would be shattered. After that time, the whole planet Immortality knew how terrifying Sword Immortal Dugu was, so no one dared to disturb him. Bufong also had a lot of peace and quiet. Although in the past, Bufong had shaken the universe and suppressed Soul God, Bufong was just a mortal now. However, he was just a mortal now. Many immortals and deities who walked the unconventional path even wanted to get the legacy from him and a higher-level cultivation technique. Of course, these immortals and deities were all fools. Those with low cultivation bases. The truly powerful immortals and deities knew very well how terrifying Bufong was. Not only Bufong, but also Xiao Bai, whose iron skin had turned upside down and whose body was rusty. That was right. Xiao Bai was rusty. As Bufong grew old, Xiao Bai seemed to decay with him. Its iron skin was covered with rust. The rust made Whitey look like it had aged and deteriorated a lot. It had not eaten for several years. It might have sensed something. It was listless. Every day, it just lay on Xiao Bai's head and stared blankly at the restaurant. Wu Shuang sighed. He walked to the entrance, opened the old wooden door, and pushed open the wooden shelves one by one. The restaurant's door opened. In an instant, it attracted the attention of countless immortals and deities. Outside, streams of light shot out as immortals turned into beams of light and flew over. They were all competing with each other in speed. They were afraid that if they fell behind, they would not be able to eat anything. Many immortals now pursued Bufong's food, not for cultivation base. Instead, it was for cultivation base. Over the past 200 years, several immortals had eaten Bufong's food. Their Tao accumulations had improved, and they broke through realms with a thought. There were even immortals who became immortal kings with a thought. This made the restaurant's reputation more and more popular. So countless immortals from all over the primitive universe rushed to this remote and distant restaurant. Line up and order. Today, only 10 diners will be served. Wushuang stood at the door, his eyes downcast, and said indifferently. He had not drawn his sword for 200 years, but his aura had become more and more terrifying. The immortals landed. They quieted down and lined up in an orderly manner. Yang Jian stepped into the restaurant with the celestial dog. Wushuang nodded at Yang Jian. Wushuang, your state of mind is still too sharp. You need to be more mellow so that you can be stronger. Too rigid is easy to break, Yang Jian said with a smile. Wushuang cupped his fist respectfully. Yang Jian sat in the restaurant and waited quietly. He was the first customer every day, and it had been like this for 200 years. If he wanted to be the first customer, who would dare to refuse? Naturally, the immortals did not dare to refuse. A delicious aroma wafted out of the kitchen. Wushuang's cold and sharp eyes glanced at the immortals below. 500 years ago, he was very respectful to immortals because he wanted to become an immortal. But after following Bu Fong for 500 years, the so-called immortals were nothing more than that. They were just people who had a hard life on the road to immortality. A clanking sound came from the kitchen. Wushuang hurried into the kitchen. He came out with a steaming dish and placed it in front of Yang Jian. The celestial dog jumped up and landed on the table. Oh, it's fried rice today. Yang Jian narrowed his eyes and chuckled. He grabbed the spoon, said nothing, and began to eat. It was not egg fried rice, but fried rice. There was something extraordinary in the simple fried rice. There were many kinds of ingredients, but no matter how rich they were, they could not hide the essence of the rice. Nowadays, the diners would not ask for anything to eat. They went into the restaurant. They ate whatever Bu Fong cooked. It was the same for Yang Jian. When the fried rice entered his mouth, the aroma of the rice and the other ingredients made him feel as if he had experienced the vanity of the world. Yang Jian closed his eyes and ate quietly. After eating for a long time, he could not help but sigh. Bu Fong's cooking skills were getting better and better. In the past, Bu Fong's food could only amaze people and arouse their appetite. But now, no matter how simple Bu Fong's dish was, it could make one's soul palpitate with just one bite. Was this progress? But the price of this progress, could he really accept it? Yang Jian opened his eyes, which were full of confusion. The ruthless path and the emotional path. In the battle back then, Soul God's shocking words and the silence of the primitive great path had, in fact, shocked the souls of many primitive immortals and deities. To set foot on the supreme peak of a universe, one must sever the 7 emotions, 6 desires, and be emotionless and thoughtless. Soul God and the soul overlords of the 7 great sins had sacrificed themselves without hesitation. Even Soul, who loved him to the extreme, had abandoned him without any reluctance. It was like the primitive great path. Even when the primitive world encountered a crisis of destruction, it remained indifferent. Was this really what a Tao seeker wanted? He ate a mouthful of fried rice. It was a simple dish, but it made Yang Jian's state of mind fluctuate. Tens of thousands of miles away from planet immortality, a stream of light flew past. A giant python crossed the planet. The next moment, it turned into a green light and turned into a lively young girl. A minotaur landed next to the girl. They landed on a dead planet. They looked into the distance at the blue planet immortality. We're finally here. The girl's voice was like pearls falling onto a jade plate. The minotaur's eyes shone brightly. Owner Boo, you want to leave me behind, but I won't let you. Nyo Han-san took out a spirit fruit and crunched it into pieces. Hua glanced at Nyo Han-san. Then her eyes fell on planet immortality again. She gritted her teeth. After hundreds of years of seclusion, she had reached the peak of the 7-colored sky devouring python. With Nyo Hansen's help, she had even completed a breakthrough evolution. Her current cultivation base was already different from before. However, when she came out of seclusion, everything had changed. The familiar aura on planet immortality made her eyes flicker slightly, and her heart, which had long been calm and tranquil, fluctuated. "Let's go," Hua said. Neo Hansen nodded. A beam of green light flew past. Hua turned into a green python again, flew across the sky, and landed on planet immortality. Neo Hansen seemed to finally be able to find Bufang. He was very excited. Rumble. The two flew toward planet immortality's atmosphere. Yang Jian, who was eating in a restaurant, opened his eyes slightly. He frowned. A seven-colored sky devouring python that has cultivated to the peak? What a strong aura. The immortals and deities on planet immortality were also shocked, and they all raised their heads. In the sky, the terrifying giant python fell, shocking heaven and earth. Ha ha ha. Honorbu, Neo Hansen is back. Neo Hansen's laughter spread over the whole planet. Ting-a-ling. The curtain of the kitchen was lifted. Bufang slowly walked out of the kitchen with a hunchback. He slowly wiped the water stains on his hands with a wet cloth. Well, it's almost time for my old friend to come. Bufang's eyes were calm. However, amidst the calmness, there was a surging intent. Wu Shuang paused. His eyes turned red. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.